Welcome to Volume 6 of our horror stories, where the rain outside sets the perfect mood for what lies ahead. Let the steady rhythm of the storm guide you deeper into the unknown, a place where shadows breathe and silence carries a weight of its own. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe so you're never far from the darkness when it calls again. Now, let the rain fall and let yourself drift into the eerie calm. Just don't let your guard down. Shall we begin? The rain pelted the cobblestone streets of Black Hollow like a staccato of sinister applause. It was a town of dark alleys and even darker whispers, nestled between a landscape that seemed to stretch forever in a sea of twisted oaks and ever-dreary fog. In Black Hollow, the sun was a guest so rare that the people who lived there would speak of its glow as if it were a tale from another world, one of warmth and reason, so removed from the endless cold that clutched the earth. Jonathan Wilkes was a scholar of antiquities, though that title was a facade he wore to cover the truth. In reality, he was a seeker of secrets, a man driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge that no conventional means could satisfy. The vast tomes that lined the walls of his chamber, each inscribed with symbols that wriggled and squirmed as the firelight flickered, were a testament to this obsession. But it was not until the letter arrived, sealed with an enigmatic crimson wax and scrawled in a hand that looked as if it were more ink than flesh, that the true extent of his madness began to take shape. The letter read, "Come to the hollow chapel at the stroke of midnight. There, beneath the altar of shadows, you shall see what lies beyond." Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as he read it again, the parchment shaking in his fingers. The chapel was a ruin on the edge of town, a place where whispered legends said the townsfolk would go to speak with ghosts. But Jonathan, a man of logic and the known, scoffed at such tales. Until now, the wind howled like a mourning banshee as he made his way through the night. The narrow streets were slick with rain, and every creak of the old timbers that made up the town's ancient buildings felt like the groan of an ancient being waking from slumber. Black Hollow held its breath, waiting. He stood before the chapel, its once grand stone facade now draped in ivy and mildew. Time had not been kind, and neither had the decades of rumors that kept it as dark as the abyss itself. Yet, Jonathan entered without hesitation, driven by a force he could not name, an irresistible pull that resonated within his bones. The air inside was thick, charged with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and ancient, like the first breaths of creation. At the center of the room, the altar loomed, its surface carved with grotesque figures that seemed to shift when viewed from the corner of the eye. Above it, a stained glass window depicted scenes of cosmic horror, great tentacled beings clawing at the heavens, faces frozen in expressions of horror, and the skeletal remains of a forgotten god. Jonathan reached for the altar with trembling hands, feeling the smooth, cold stone under his fingertips. And then, from deep within the chapel, a sound began, a low, guttural vibration that rattled the stones and crawled up his spine. It was a noise that suggested existence itself was quivering. A voice, soft and insidious, whispered his name. Jonathan. He spun around, eyes wide and heart pounding like a drum of war. The shadows in the chapel seemed to shift, breaking apart and coalescing into something unholy. From the darkness, a figure emerged, robed in garments that seemed woven from the night itself. Its face was obscured by a cowl, but Jonathan felt its gaze, a pressure against his mind that left him breathless. "You have come," the voice spoke, echoing through the chamber like a chant, mingling with the sound of the wind outside. "Who are you?" Jonathan stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "An observer," came the reply, "a witness to that which should never be known." Jonathan's gaze dropped to the floor, where a series of ancient runes had been carved into the stone in a pattern that seemed to form a path leading into darkness. The light of the torches around the room sputtered, their flames leaning away as if repelled by what lay ahead. "What is this?" Jonathan demanded, his voice laced with fear. "A gift," the figure replied. "And a warning." Suddenly, the air trembled, and Jonathan stumbled backward as a low moan rose from beneath the altar. The earth cracked, and the runes glowed with a sickly, pulsating light. He fell to his knees as the stone before him cracked apart, revealing a pit that seemed to descend endlessly into the dark. From its depths, A voice called out, not in words, but in a deep, resounding vibration that seemed to speak directly to his mind. The eye sees all, it intoned. The void welcomes those who seek beyond. Jonathan felt his vision blur, the room spinning as though he were caught in the grip of an unseen cyclone. His mind screamed at him to run, but his body was frozen. The figure above him raised its arm, and from the sleeve of its robe, a thin tendril, black as a raven's wing, reached out and touched the center of his forehead. Pain exploded in Jonathan's head, raw and searing. The chapel, the town of Black Hollow, and everything he had ever known faded into an abyss of agony. Images flooded his mind, visions of stars so distant they were almost dreams, of creatures with eyes as wide as oceans and teeth that devoured reality itself. He saw a place where time had no meaning and space was but a canvas for horrors unspeakable. "You have been chosen," the figure said, its voice now a chorus of 1,000 whispers, "to witness the truth that none dare seek." And then, Jonathan Wilkes felt himself slipping, his senses dissolving into a darkness so absolute that it seemed to devour even the echo of his own scream. Jonathan's awareness returned in fits and spurts, like a flickering flame in a windstorm. The darkness was still there, suffocating and absolute, but it was now interlaced with fleeting images, glimpses of shapes beyond comprehension, of eyes that stared with an unblinking, all-seeing gaze. He was no longer in the chapel. He was somewhere far removed, somewhere that existed in a place where reality and nightmare intertwined. He found himself suspended, weightless, yet crushed under a weight that defied reason. The echoes of the chanting voices surrounded him, each one a note of torment and revelation. With an effort that seemed to drain the last reserves of his will, Jonathan forced his eyes open. But there was no chapel, no altar, and no figure shrouded in black. He was in an expanse that seemed to stretch forever, an abyss of shifting shadows and glistening, iridescent tendrils that reached out to him, brushing against his mind with unseen fingers. "Jonathan Wilkes," came the voice, now softer, almost sympathetic. "Do you see now?" He tried to respond, but no sound escaped his lips. His body was no longer his own. It was a vessel caught between realms, tethered by the fragile strands of his sanity. Before him, a great, cyclopean shape emerged, not in any form that the human eye could truly recognize, but an amalgamation of horror and beauty that defied description. It was an ancient god, its singular eye the size of a great chasm, filled with depths that threatened to consume his mind. The eye blinked, and with that motion, the expanse shifted, a ripple passing through the darkness that made Jonathan's soul quiver. "You have seen what lies beyond the known," the voice continued, now growing stronger, more corporeal. "You have glimpsed the true nature of existence. Do you not feel it? The rush of understanding." A shudder racked his frame, but the response was silent. Yet, he felt it, an electric current coursing through him, sparking memories that were not his own. Memories of impossible lands, of gods that were born from the void and perished in the light of stars. The image of the altar in Black Hollow was a mere whisper compared to this, a shadow of what his mind now processed. "I am the last witness of the Eldritch epoch," the voice said, resonating in the vast expanse, filling every fiber of Jonathan's being. "Those who seek truth beyond the mortal coil pay the price of their sanity. Your journey has only just begun." Jonathan's vision wavered as an unbearable light erupted from the center of the abyss, a light that blazed and shifted in an array of colors that no human eye could process. He screamed, or at least he thought he did. His voice was lost in the cacophony, swallowed by the screams of forgotten beings and the eternal murmurs of the abyss. Time, if it could be called that, seemed to fold upon itself. Jonathan saw flashes of his life, memories that grew foreign, tainted by cosmic truths. The face of his mother, her gentle eyes now twisted into a grimace of unknowing horror. The library where he had once read tales of forbidden lore, now a cathedral of madness where tomes bled black ink that dripped like the tears of an ancient, forgotten god. He was drowning in revelations, unable to decipher where he ended and the madness began. The voice spoke again, now like a chorus of 1,000 lost souls. "To bear witness is to surrender. To seek truth is to be consumed. Do you understand, Jonathan?" With a final, desperate shudder, Jonathan felt himself being pulled back, wrenched from the abyss as if by some unseen force. He was no longer surrounded by a realm of eternal dark but by the suffocating silence of his chamber in Black Hollow. The walls, once lined with relics of forgotten knowledge, now stood as empty sentinels, their cracked surfaces reflecting a grim truth. He gasped for breath, his body trembling, the echoes of alien voices still reverberating in his ears. His mind reeled as he tried to reconcile the reality before him with the visions that had clawed at the edges of his consciousness. There was no doubt now. He had seen the true face of existence, and it was monstrous. But the voice was still there, deep within his mind, a whisper that was neither reassuring nor kind. "You have seen the truth, Jonathan Wilkes. And now, it sees you." Jonathan fell to the floor, a broken man, his sanity stripped raw and exposed. Outside, the rain continued its ceaseless descent, the sound like a hollow laugh, as if Black Hollow itself were mocking him, a town that had always known the price of curiosity. And, deep within the dark, the eye watched and waited, waiting for the next fool to stumble upon the hollow altar, to peer into the unknown and find there, staring back, an ancient, unspeakable truth. Jonathan's trembling hands reached out, clutching the edge of the wooden desk as if it were the only thing tethering him to this reality. His breaths came in ragged, shallow gasps, the rhythmic pounding of his heart sounding like a drumbeat of madness. The whispers in his mind had grown louder, morphing into a chorus of chittering voices that spoke in tongues older than time. He pressed his palms hard against his temples, trying to block out the cacophony, to drown out the cold, distant laughter that seemed to echo through the chamber. Outside, the storm raged on, the wind howling like a chorus of the damned. The trees creaked and groaned, their limbs twisting in defiance against the storm's cruel embrace. The rain lashed against the windows, blurring the line between what was inside and what was out. But it was not just the storm that made Jonathan shiver. The air around him felt charged, almost alive with a pulsing, electric tension that prickled his skin like the approach of a predator. A sharp knock at the door shattered the madness that clawed at him, drawing his gaze upward with a start. It was an unearthly sound, sharp and final, as if a hand made of bone and shadow had rapped against the old wood. He hesitated, every instinct in his body screaming at him to remain silent, to hide from whatever waited beyond the threshold. Yet, the knock came again, this time more urgent, as though the unseen visitor could not, or would not, be ignored. Who's they?" Jonathan croaked, his voice trembling and foreign to his own ears. The chamber seemed to close in around him, the walls pressing tighter, suffocating him with the weight of knowledge he was never meant to possess. A pause. The silence was so complete that Jonathan could hear his own heartbeat, thudding in his chest like the drums of an ancient rite. Then, the voice came, soft and slithering, like a serpent whispering secrets from the depths. "Jonathan Wilkes," it purred, the voice familiar yet alien, twisted with the dark resonance of otherworldly power. "You cannot escape what has been seen. You have been chosen." He staggered back, the edges of his vision blurring as he tried to focus. The room seemed to warp, the familiar contours of bookshelves and the old fireplace dissolving into shadow. And then he saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, draped in robes as dark as the abyss itself, its face obscured by a cowl that seemed to twist and shift, revealing glimpses of other, monstrous visages beneath. The air grew colder, and Jonathan's breath came out in panicked clouds. His limbs felt leaden, shackled by an unseen weight. The figure took a step forward, and with each move, the shadows it cast seemed to darken the room even more. "No one who gazes into the true darkness emerges unscarred," it intoned, its voice a chorus of suffering souls. "You have seen what lurks beyond the veil. Now, you must serve or be consumed." Jonathan's mind splintered, fragments of reason scattered like glass underfoot. He wanted to scream, to flee, but his voice failed him, his body paralyzed. Memories of the altar, the rituals, the eye that had burned his mind, everything came crashing back, each vision a shard of ice piercing his sanity. He reached out, fingers clawing at the air as if trying to grasp some semblance of normalcy, but the figure was already upon him, its presence an avalanche of darkness that blotted out the light. The last thing he saw before the abyss claimed him was the figure's eye, an eye like the one he had glimpsed in the otherworldly void, wide and unblinking, with a depth that seemed to pull him in, pulling him toward a fate far worse than death. The darkness erupted around him, swallowing him whole. And then, there was only silence. Let me preface this account with an earnest plea. Do not seek what lies beneath the veil of the mundane. There is a sanctuary in ignorance, a fragile balm to the human soul that keeps us from succumbing to the vastness of what we dare not comprehend. I write this not as a warning, for I fear it is too late for that, but as a record for the unfortunate who might find themselves drawn, as I was, into the embrace of the abyss. My name, though it hardly matters now, is Elias Carnsworth. Before the events that unraveled my sanity, I was a lecturer of marine archaeology at Miskatonic University, a position I held with pride and reverence. My pursuits were not uncommon for someone in my field, mapping ancient shipwrecks, cataloging relics of a bygone age, and indulging in the occasional expedition funded by the university. It was during one such endeavor that I first heard whispers of the abyssal call. The name came to me from a fragmentary journal I uncovered amidst the wreck of the Enduring Providence, a whaling ship that had disappeared in 1876, taking with it all hands and leaving behind only wild tales of storms and sea monsters. The journal belonged to its captain, Alden Greaves, whose last entry was chilling in its brevity. They sing to me from the black. Their voices are the death knell of reason. We are undone. These words should have dissuaded me. They should have ended my fascination with the Providence and her ill-fated crew. Instead, they consumed me. The subsequent weeks were a haze of research and obsession. I combed through maritime records, folklore, and half-remembered tales from seafarers too old to care about the ridicule of their peers. A pattern began to emerge, one I could scarcely believe but could not ignore. Across centuries and continents, there were stories of sailors hearing a song, not the keening wail of wind through sails nor the haunting cry of seabirds, but a melody impossibly deep, resonant, and otherworldly. It was described as both a siren's lure and a dirge for the soul, a sound that beckoned men to their doom beneath the waves. Some accounts spoke of entire ships vanishing without a trace, their crews leaving behind only fragmented records of madness and despair. What troubled me most was the recurrence of a single location. The coordinates 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west. A barren stretch of ocean, far from any trade route or known landmass. It seemed to be the epicenter of these tales. The location came to be known among sailors as the Silent Meridian. I resolved to go there, driven not by courage but by a fatal curiosity I could neither suppress nor explain. Our vessel, the Ardent Explorer, was modest but capable, her crew an assortment of seasoned mariners and eager scholars. I chose my team with care, selecting those who possessed a balance of expertise and skepticism. Yet, as we neared the meridian, a palpable unease settled over us. The sea grew unnaturally still, its surface an unbroken mirror that reflected the sullen gray of the sky. It was on the 7th day that we first heard it, the song. At first, it was faint, barely distinguishable from the creak of the ship's timbers or the murmur of the ocean. But as the hours passed, it grew louder, more insistent, a low thrumming that resonated in our bones. It defied language, a sound both musical and alien, invoking a primal fear that defied logic. My crewmates reacted as if a switch had been flipped within them. Some grew silent and withdrawn, their eyes glassy and unfocused. Others became agitated, muttering half-formed words in languages I did not recognize. I, too, felt the song's pull, a seductive promise of knowledge and revelation, of truths buried in the depths where no light had ever reached. It was on the 9th day that we saw the first sign of the abyssal entity. The sonar detected an anomaly, an impossibly vast structure beneath us, its contours defying natural geometry. It was not a shipwreck nor a natural formation, but something else entirely, something alive with an ancient malevolence that could not be comprehended by mortal minds. The descent into the depths was fraught with terror. As our submersible plunged into the ink-black sea, the song grew deafening, and with it came visions, shadows of creatures too immense and grotesque to be real, their forms writhing in defiance of physics and reason. When we reached the structure, We found it was no ruin but a temple, its spires and arches etched with symbols that seemed to writhe and shimmer as if alive. The temple seemed to pulsate with an unholy rhythm, matching the cadence of the song. It was as though the structure itself was alive, breathing, its alien geometry defying all comprehension. The carvings on its surface were not merely ornamental. They conveyed something, stories, warnings, or perhaps commands. But their meaning eluded us, leaving only a profound sense of unease. As we approached the edifice, the light from our submersible's beams seemed to falter, swallowed by the oppressive blackness that emanated from the temple. The closer we came, the more the crew succumbed to madness. Dr. Ellison, our linguist, began to speak in tongues, his voice guttural and unnatural, as though some other being was speaking through him. Harding, our engineer, clawed at his own skin, screaming that something was inside him, crawling, watching. I should have ordered us to surface then, to abandon this cursed place. But the song, oh, that accursed melody, had sunk its hooks into my soul. It promised answers, enlightenment, an escape from the fragility of human existence. And so, we pressed on. The submersible docked at what appeared to be an entrance, an archway so massive it dwarfed our vessel. The opening emitted a faint bioluminescent glow, its hue a sickly green that seemed to seep into the edges of my vision. We disembarked, stepping onto a surface that felt unnervingly organic, like flesh stretched taut over bone. Inside, the air, or whatever passed for it, was thick and oppressive, carrying with it a stench of decay and brine. The walls were alive with movement, tendrils of some unnameable substance writhing in and out of the carvings. Dr. Ellison collapsed to his knees, convulsing, his eyes rolling back as he began to chant. The words were not his own but those of something older, something watching. What followed was chaos. Harding, in his madness, struck one of the bioluminescent walls with a wrench, and the structure responded as though wounded, emitting a low, resonant groan that reverberated through the temple. The floor beneath us shifted, and the song intensified, no longer a seductive melody but a cacophony of anguish and rage. It was then that we saw it. The entity defied form, an amalgamation of shadows and shapes that seemed to flicker between dimensions. Its eyes, or what I perceived as eyes, bored into my soul, filling my mind with visions of a universe far older and more hostile than I had ever imagined. It was not merely a creature but an idea, a concept of such vastness that to comprehend it would shatter the mind. The crew fell apart. Harding was the first to succumb, throwing himself into one of the writhing walls, which absorbed him like quicksand. Dr. Ellison's chanting reached a fever pitch before he too collapsed, his body crumbling into dust as though he had aged centuries in mere seconds. And yet, I remained. Perhaps it was the song, now intertwined with my very being, that shielded me. Or perhaps the entity had a purpose for me, a cruel amusement in sparing my life as it claimed the others. The temple began to collapse as the entity receded into the shadows, its wrath momentarily sated. I stumbled back to the submersible, alone and half-mad, and initiated the ascent. The journey to the surface was agonizing, the song fading but never fully leaving me. Its echoes lingered in my mind, a constant reminder of what I had seen. When I finally emerged into the daylight, I was greeted not by salvation but by desolation. The ardent explorer was gone, vanished without a trace, leaving me adrift in the open ocean. The horizon was empty, save for the encroaching storm clouds that seemed unnaturally dark, as though the entity's presence had followed me to the surface. I write this account from the solitude of a hospital room, where I am kept under constant observation. The doctors believe me to be delusional, a victim of deep-sea psychosis. They do not hear the song that still plays in the back of my mind, growing louder with each passing day. I know it is only a matter of time before it calls me back to the depths. For the entity does not forget, nor does it forgive. It waits in the silent places of the world, biding its time until we are foolish enough to seek it out once more. Do not listen to the song. Do not look into the abyss. For the abyss is always looking back.
The night fell heavy on St. Agatha's Hospital, draped in a veil of fog that seemed to curl and twist like something alive. Inside, the fluorescent lights flickered, casting erratic shadows that made the corridors appear twisted, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Nurse Eleanor Langford walked down the hallway, the thin heels of her shoes clicking in time with the steady beat of her heart. This was her shift, the one that began when the world turned cold and silent, where most souls found comfort in sleep. But not here. The wards were never truly empty. The faint hum of machines and distant murmurs were the only sounds that filled the void. Yet tonight, there was a wrongness to it, a tightness in the air that made her throat close up. Eleanor had worked at St. Agatha's for years, long enough to know the routine, the odd hours, and the haunting stories whispered among the staff. Tales of unexplained movements, shadows slipping past corners, and patients who spoke of figures in the night, figures with eyes that glistened like wet stones. She had scoffed at those stories once, but now, with each passing hour, the stories felt less like rumors and more like warnings. She passed room 311, its door ajar, the faint crack of light seeping out, casting narrow slivers across the floor. A low moan echoed inside, distant but unmistakable. Eleanor hesitated, breath caught in her chest. It was a sound she had come to know well, the pained, almost pleading voice of Mr. Whitaker. The man had been a patient for over a month now, suffering from a condition no doctor dared name. His pale, cracked lips whispered secrets too horrifying to share, and every night he would beg to be let out, to be freed from something that gripped him tighter than any disease. A soft shiver ran down Eleanor's spine as she reached out to push the door open. The air grew colder, brushing against her skin like an unseen hand. Inside, Mr. Whitaker lay twisted on the bed, his emaciated body shivering beneath the thin hospital sheets. His eyes, hollow and wide, fixed on her with an unnatural intensity. "I told you not to come," he rasped, the sound brittle as dry leaves. Eleanor stepped in, her fingers tightening around the handle of her clipboard as she forced herself to meet his gaze. The room smelled of antiseptic, but something else mingled in, a scent like rotting meat, sour and sickly. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "Mr. Whitaker, it's time for your medication," she said, the tremor in her voice betraying her. "No," he whispered, and the rasp of his voice seemed to echo, almost like a chorus. "Not tonight. Not tonight." The overhead lights flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a moment that felt like an eternity. When they blinked back to life, something had changed. The room seemed to lean forward, its walls pressing in, breathing with a life of their own. But it was not the room that had shifted, it was the space behind Mr. Whitaker. He turned his head slowly, a grotesque sound like cracking bone following the motion. His eyes rolled back, revealing a dark cavity where no white should have been. And there, in the corner, a shape emerged, a thing not of flesh, but of shadow, with limbs that were too long and twisted at angles that defied reason. Eleanor's heart stopped. The sight was impossible, as though the fabric of reality had been torn, and through it, something ancient and unknowable seeped into her world. "I warned you," Mr. Whitaker's voice deepened, no longer his own, but that of something else. "We all warned you." The floor creaked under her feet as she stumbled backward. Her pulse drummed against her ribs, and she was aware of her own trembling hands. The creature stepped forward, its movements liquid and unnatural, and as it did, the air thickened with a sound like rasping, scraping metal. Eleanor reached for her radio, but the static that burst forth was not the comforting buzz she expected. It was a voice, deep and guttural, whispering in a language that made her head spin and the blood freeze in her veins. Eleanor's hand trembled as she gripped the radio, the static hissing like a chorus of serpents. The voice behind it was sharp, dissonant, and ancient, sending a jolt of fear straight through her chest. She dropped it in her panic, the device clattering to the floor and releasing a spray of sparks that danced like fireflies in the dim light. The creature advanced, its limbs folding and twisting in ways that should have been impossible. Its torso was thin, almost skeletal, but wrapped in layers of shadow that shifted and pulsed, revealing glimpses of something like sinew and bone beneath. Eleanor's mind screamed at her to flee, but her legs felt as though they were cast in concrete, rooted to the floor by a force far stronger than her own terror. The hallway outside seemed to echo her dread, but the sounds that seeped in were not the usual hum of machinery or distant footsteps. Instead, they were guttural, wet sounds, the thud of something large and heavy dragging itself toward her. "Don't," Mr. Whitaker said, a voice torn between his own rasp and the deeper, sinister undertone that had emerged from his mouth. His eyes, once filled with confusion and pleading, now glistened with the kind of knowledge that made the mind crack. It knows. The creature's face, if it could be called that, was an ever-shifting blur of darkness, dotted with eyes that blinked and wept black tears. One of them locked with Eleanor's, and in that instant, she felt the world shift. Her thoughts splintered, and a cold, ancient voice whispered within her mind, an invitation to madness. "You will join us," it said, a promise that tasted of rot and decay. Her pulse quickened as the room darkened further, the walls now pressing in like the fingers of a malevolent hand. The air was rank with a tang of something metallic, and her vision blurred with a surreal, crimson haze. Eleanor could feel the thin membrane between sanity and insanity straining, as if it were about to snap. "No," she whispered, but the sound was drowned out by the echoing shriek of the creature. It lunged forward, its limbs slithering across the floor, and Eleanor stumbled backward, her vision spinning. A sudden thud rattled the room as a figure appeared in the doorway. A figure in a lab coat, face obscured by the shadows but moving with a sure, deliberate stride. It was Dr. Monroe, the night supervisor who had been an enigma since the day Eleanor first walked into St. Agatha's. His eyes, dark and hollow, met hers, and for the briefest moment, she thought she saw a glimmer of recognition. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something else. "Get out," he rasped, though his voice was not entirely his own. Before she could move, the creature's sinewy arm shot out, knocking her to the ground. The cold bite of the linoleum floor burned against her cheek as the creature loomed over her, its form more solid now, a mixture of shadow and grotesque flesh. The foul stench was suffocating, and Eleanor could taste the sourness on her tongue as she tried to scream, but her voice was choked off by terror. Dr. Monroe moved forward, but he was no longer himself. His eyes, wide and glazed, held the dark, unknowable depth of a mind broken by something far worse than death. His mouth opened, but instead of words, a guttural growl escaped him, and from the depths of his throat came a shadow that reached out to Eleanor, tendrils writhing like hungry serpents. Eleanor's vision dimmed as her head spun, and the shadow coiled around her, cold and seeping into her very bones. The creature's eyes met hers again, and in that moment, she felt the boundaries of her sanity dissolve, replaced by a terror so profound, it became a part of her. The creature's whisper pierced her consciousness, each word like a shard of ice in her soul. "You cannot run from what you are." The world around Eleanor seemed to tilt, the walls of room 311 warping and folding in on themselves as though they were made of paper. The shadow that had erupted from Dr. Monroe's throat slithered over her, its edges writhing like hungry worms. It reached for her neck, tightening around it with a cold, constricting force. Her vision tunneled, and she clawed at the air, fighting for breath as her hands scraped against the icy, slick surface of the creature. Through the growing haze, she heard Mr. Whitaker's voice again, softer now, almost gentle. "It's too late," he said, but it was the voice of someone who had already surrendered, a voice that spoke of acceptance and despair. "We're already part of it." The shadow pulsed, taking on a darker, deeper hue. In its depths, Eleanor could see glimpses of things that were not meant to be seen, eyes like black holes, mouths agape in silent agony, limbs twisted in grotesque, unholy contortions. They reached out for her, calling her name in a cacophony of whispers that made her ears ring. Her heartbeat pounded in her chest, a deafening thrum that threatened to crush her ribcage. She kicked and screamed, but the shadow held her fast, drawing her deeper into its grasp. The room seemed to fold in on itself with each beat, the fluorescent lights flickering wildly, as if struggling to stay alive in the growing dark. The stench of rot and decay was suffocating, but now there was something else, a deep, sickly sweetness that made her stomach turn. It was the smell of something old, something that had been buried and left to fester in the damp earth for centuries. And yet, it was alive, moving with a rhythm that pulsed like a heartbeat. Dr. Monroe's body stood rigid, eyes blank and unmoving, as though he were being controlled from within. A thin line of black liquid dripped from his mouth, pooling at his feet and spreading outward in concentric circles. The shadow that had spilled from him seemed to resonate with that liquid, drawing strength from it as if it were a lifeblood. The voice in Eleanor's mind grew louder, gnawing at her consciousness with words that defied human understanding. They were ancient, echoing in a language lost to time, filled with a weight that pressed against her sanity like a vice. She could feel the chill of it seeping through her veins, turning her blood to ice, making her limbs feel like lead. "I'm not ready," she whispered, the words slipping through her lips like a prayer, an invocation of denial. "Not ready?" came a voice from somewhere near, but it wasn't Mr. Whitaker. It was a sound like the screech of metal on metal, and when Eleanor turned her head, she saw the shadow twisting into a face, an amalgamation of every human expression twisted in agony and fear. The eyes were black and deep, and in them, she saw herself, caught and trapped like an insect in amber. "You were never meant to be," the voice rasped, and it was as if the creature had spoken the truth of all existence, a revelation that cracked her mind wide open. The walls groaned, the floor shivered, and she felt herself being pulled forward, pulled into that impossible living mass. The shadow was everywhere now, draped across the floor and climbing up her legs, cold and clammy. She was being swallowed by it, devoured by its strange, hungry embrace. The fingers that clawed at her were not her own, but something else, reaching, grasping, trying to pull her into the depths. The heartbeat in her chest slowed to a heavy, sluggish beat, as if it too was being devoured by the darkness. Eleanor gasped for breath, but no air came. Her vision blurred, the last thing she saw being the glistening, black eyes of the creature and the broken, pleading face of Mr. Whitaker. Eleanor's vision grew dim, the edges of her sight darkening into a thick, impenetrable shadow. Her body, once capable of movement and defiance, now felt as though it had been carved from stone, cold and lifeless. The pulse of the creature thrummed around her, a grotesque symphony that echoed the beating of her own heart, a heartbeat that was now erratic, desperate. The room had become a cavern of endless night, where time ceased to exist and the weight of silence pressed down with the force of a mountain. A low, guttural hiss erupted from the shadow, reverberating through her very bones. It was the sound of an ancient thing, something that had slumbered beneath the earth for eons, waiting for a crack to open and let it loose. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat, an iron grip of terror squeezing her from the inside out. She felt her sanity unraveling, thread by thread, as the creature's presence invaded every inch of her mind, every crevice of her soul. From within the writhing mass, a single tendril broke free, slick with black bile, and reached for her face. It was thin, sinuous, and impossibly fast, coiling around her jaw and pulling her toward the source of that unearthly, droning hum. Eleanor's scream echoed, thin and brittle, against the walls of the suffocating darkness. The smell of rot intensified, mingling with the putrid sweetness that clawed at her senses. She felt a choking wave of nausea rising in her throat. "Help me," she rasped, but the plea fell silent as the room grew colder, if that were possible. The temperature plummeted, and a sudden frost curled around the edges of the walls and floor, a creeping ice that sapped the last warmth from the air. The shadow quivered, its surface now a mirror that reflected a fractured version of her own terrified eyes. The tendril pulled tighter, and she felt the bite of its grasp on her skin, leaving imprints like bruises in its wake. The drumming in her ears grew louder, merging with the frantic pounding of her heart, a chorus of dread that drowned out all other thought. Her skin felt clammy, prickled with cold sweat, and she trembled as the shadow moved closer, revealing hints of other, darker shapes within it. Faces, mouths agape in agony, fingers reaching out, pleading for release. She glanced at Mr. Whitaker, whose eyes were wide, pupils dilated with the horror of recognition. The black fluid that dripped from his mouth pooled around his feet, spreading like a living thing. It crept toward her, dragging the scent of decay and ruin, and she realized, with a sickening jolt, that the floor beneath her had begun to crack and splinter, splitting open to reveal a void that pulsed with a rhythmic, pulsing light, something that moved and shifted just beneath the surface, like a second heartbeat. "No, no, no," Eleanor whispered, her voice a broken chant that did nothing to soothe the panic clawing at her throat. Her limbs were frozen, her vision clouded, but she could still feel the presence of the creature pressing against her mind, each tendril a lifeline to a maddening, unknowable consciousness. The walls shuddered as if in pain, the ceiling above cracking, and from those fissures, more tendrils spilled out, reaching and pulling, dragging her into the living, thrashing darkness. The floor beneath her crumbled, and she felt herself slipping, falling, drawn by the whisper of darkness and the ceaseless pulse that had become the measure of her existence. The tendrils tightened their grip, and for a moment, all was still, an awful, suffocating silence that stretched and pressed, waiting. Then, the creature's face appeared in front of her, an abomination of shifting shadows and twisted flesh. Eyes within eyes, mouths within mouths, each revealing a landscape of pain, despair, and ancient, unspeakable knowledge. Its voice slithered into her mind, seeping through her defenses and shattering whatever semblance of composure she had left. "Join us," it whispered, and the very fabric of reality seemed to bend with the weight of its command. The cold seeped deeper, and Eleanor felt the final threads of her mind snap, leaving only the raw, unfiltered essence of her terror. Eleanor's mind splintered, the last vestiges of her sanity breaking apart like dry glass. The shadow that had surrounded her now coalesced into a single, monstrous form, a grotesque figure made of darkness and memory, its limbs writhing with unnatural speed, its head tilting in a gesture of terrible curiosity. The room shrieked as if the walls themselves were in agony, the fluorescent lights shattering, and the cold intensified to an unbearable point, pricking her skin like 1,000 needles. The tendrils constricted around her, pulling tighter, cutting off her breath. She struggled, her muscles quivering as though each nerve was aflame. The creature's eyes, black voids of depthless malice, were fixed on her. It pulled her close, the sound of her heartbeat now a deafening roar in her ears. For a moment, the world was reduced to that single, suffocating gaze. "You have no choice," the creature murmured, its voice slicing through her mind, cold and implacable. The black liquid pooled beneath her, spreading like ink across the floor. It reached out, touching her shoes, crawling up her legs, seeking her warmth, her life. She screamed, a raw, desperate sound that seemed to reverberate off the walls, but it was met with silence, an oppressive, eternal silence that consumed the hospital room. The shadows around her began to twist, seething with anticipation, and in their center, the figure split apart like a wound opening, revealing a yawning, gaping maw of countless jagged teeth. Eleanor's vision blurred as a burning sensation swept through her, and she realized, with horror, that the black liquid had reached her skin, seeping into her pores. It wasn't cold, it was fire, a hellish, consuming fire that spread from her legs to her chest, making her scream again, this time in a raw, untamed agony that left her shaking. The creature's mouth opened wider, and the whisper of its voice, a serpentine hiss, reached her ears once more. Death is but the beginning. Suddenly, the world buckled beneath her feet. The ground cracked and split, the darkness bleeding through the crevices. Eleanor's vision cleared for a brief, horrifying moment, and she saw Dr. Monroe standing at the edge of the abyss, his eyes now a blazing white that burned with an unnatural light. The shadow within him pulsed, sending ripples across the ground that seemed to reach for her, drawing her in. "Let go," he whispered, his voice broken, as though the words had been torn from him. His expression twisted in what could have been guilt or sorrow. "You have to let go." Tears streamed down her face, mixing with the bile that rose in her throat. "No," she gasped, shuddering as the burning liquid consumed her chest, its searing tendrils inching toward her neck. She clawed at the air, her fingers brushing against the cold, sterile tiles, looking for something, anything, that might save her. But the tendrils were insatiable, more determined than any force she had ever known. The creature let out a roar, a sound that split the silence with a force that made her bones tremble. The air was now filled with the screech of metal, the roar of flames, and the desperate beat of her heart. The creature's maw opened wide, revealing a hollow that seemed to twist the fabric of space itself, a gate to an unspeakable void where light dared not venture. And then it began to pull. Eleanor's body was yanked forward, past the threshold of the room and into the yawning darkness, the walls shattering around her like glass under pressure. The scream that tore from her throat was not just a cry of terror, it was a sound of pure, primal dread, echoing in the empty corridors as the light around her blinked out, leaving only the sound of the creature's laughter, deep and unending. Her mind, torn between consciousness and oblivion, flailed as she was pulled into the depths of that darkness. The last thing she saw was the haunted face of Mr. Whitaker, eyes wide with a mixture of horror and something else, something she couldn't name. And then, as the tendrils wrapped around her and the world grew colder, the abyss took her, swallowing her whole, leaving nothing but the echo of her scream. The darkness closed in around Eleanor, an oppressive wave that crushed her body and twisted her soul. The tendrils, slick with the black, bile-like substance, coiled around her limbs with a relentlessness that defied reason. The room dissolved into nothingness, replaced by the yawning void where she now found herself, a place devoid of light or sound, save for the whisper of 1,000 agonized voices. The creature loomed behind her, its grotesque, shifting form blotting out what little was left of her vision. Eleanor's screams, raw and strangled, gave way to desperate sobs as the reality of her fate sank in. The black liquid had spread through her veins, crawling with an insidious hunger that turned her blood to fire. She convulsed, the muscles in her arms and legs spasming uncontrollably, locking her in place. Pain roared through her, a deep, insufferable torment that tore at her very core, unraveling her flesh from the inside out. The creature's maw, now a chasm of jagged teeth and glistening, pulsing tendrils, opened wider, emitting a sound that was both a roar and a mournful sigh. From the darkness, a sharp, metallic sting surged through her chest as one of its tendrils plunged deep into her, breaking skin, muscle, and bone. The force of it ripped into her ribs with a sickening crack that echoed in her ears. Eleanor's vision darkened, a shiver of cold spreading from her heart to her limbs. As the creature's tendrils dug deeper, her skin split open, dark ichor seeping from the wound and mixing with the blackness that encased her. The tendrils pulled and twisted, warping her body in unnatural ways, contorting her muscles as if they were pliable wax. A guttural sound rose from her throat, half a scream, half a choking gasp, as her ribs fractured under the pressure. Her chest expanded and collapsed, a gruesome parody of breathing, as blood leaked from the corner of her mouth. Her hands, trembling with the last vestiges of will, reached up to the wound in her chest, fingers slipping through the dark, viscous fluid. The pain was all-consuming, every nerve in her body screaming for release that would never come. The creature's laughter resonated, a deep, resonant sound that made the walls of the darkness shudder. The final seconds blurred together, filled with agony and the deafening chorus of her failing heart. Her vision tunneled, the edges blackening as the darkness whispered its victory. The last thing she saw before the pain consumed her entirely was the face of Dr. Monroe, his eyes wide, filled with both regret and terror. But before she could scream for him one final time, the tendrils coiled tighter, cracking her ribcage in a sickening crunch, and she felt the wet, hot spill of her own insides being forced out of her, running down her chest in a rivulet of death. And then, nothing. The room fell silent, the echoes of her last breath swallowed by the darkness, and the creature, now sated, began to retreat into the shadows, leaving only the stain of her suffering behind, a reminder that death in the presence of such malevolence was never kind, only brutal, raw, and grotesque.
The fog wrapped around the car like a cold breath, clinging to the windows as Thomas drove deeper into the mountain range. He didn't know why he kept going. Maybe it was the pull of a promise made long ago, or perhaps the cryptic letters had pushed him too far, leading him to a place he couldn't undo. Belgrave. The town was a speck in the distance on the map, a forgotten name that most wouldn't even recognize, but its reputation had carved its mark into Thomas's conscience. It had been years since he last heard the name, years since he had fled from the consequences of his own failures. But something about the letters had brought it all back. They were simple, vague. A series of invitations, really, each one written by different hands but saying the same thing. You can't escape what's coming. Only Belgrave offers redemption. But be warned, every wish carries a cost. He had dismissed them at first. People often wrote nonsense when they were desperate. But then the nightmares began. Dreams of his past, of people he had wronged, of lives destroyed by his inaction and neglect. And when he woke, the guilt was still there, gnawing at him, clawing at his very soul. It was after one of these dreams that Thomas finally packed his bags and left. He had no idea what to expect in Belgrave, but he couldn't go on carrying the weight of his actions. There had to be someone that could take it away. The road to Belgrave was narrow and winding, a dark ribbon of asphalt cutting through dense, oppressive woods. The air felt colder here, even in the late summer, and the silence was oppressive. There were no other cars, no signs of life. The woods seemed to close in around him, the trees standing like ancient sentinels, their gnarled branches twisting in unnatural directions. As Thomas neared the town, his pulse quickened. The fog thickened, and soon the outline of the town emerged, nothing more than a shadow in the distance, shrouded in mist. The buildings were dilapidated, their windows shattered or boarded up. It felt like a place that time had abandoned, left to rot in its own sorrow. He slowed as he entered, scanning the empty streets. No one was out, not a single person in sight. Yet the town felt alive, in a way, as though it were watching him. Thomas felt eyes on him, from behind the boarded-up windows or from within the trees that loomed at the edges of the town. A shiver ran down his spine. The first building he came across was the inn, a small, crooked structure that appeared as if it had been standing for centuries. It was the only place that looked remotely inhabited, so he pulled into the dirt lot and parked. As he stepped out of the car, the air felt even colder, the fog seeping under his skin. The door creaked open before he could knock. A figure stood in the doorway, a man gaunt and thin, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. His skin was pale, almost sickly, and his movements were slow and deliberate, as though every action took an enormous effort. "You've come," the man rasped, his voice rough like gravel. I wondered when someone would. Thomas didn't know how to respond, but the man didn't wait for an answer. He stepped aside, gesturing for Thomas to enter. The interior of the inn was dimly lit, with a smell of mildew and decayed wood permeating the air. The man didn't say another word but led him to a small, windowless room at the back of the building. The room was bare except for an old chair, a small table, and a thin cot. There was no warmth here, no comfort, only the weight of silence pressing down on him. "Why are you here?" the man asked after a long pause, his eyes fixed on Thomas. "What is it you seek from Belgrave?" Thomas hesitated. The letter, the warning, all of it swirled in his mind, but his mouth felt dry, as though his words would betray him. Finally, he spoke. "I came because I need to make things right. I've done terrible things, and I want to change. I've heard that something in Belgrave can give me a chance." The man's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile. "Everyone who comes here believes they can fix what they've broken. But what you want isn't so simple. It never is. I don't care about the cost. I'll do whatever it takes," Thomas said, his voice more forceful than he intended. The man's smile faded, and his eyes seemed to grow darker. "Then you'll have to speak with the Hollow. It's where all things lost and broken come to find their price." Thomas frowned. "The Hollow?" The man nodded gravely. "Yes, but it's not a place you can simply walk to. You'll need to prove yourself first. The Hollow doesn't speak to just anyone. There are tests, trials. They'll challenge your very soul." Thomas's heart pounded. The weight of his past loomed over him, but the promise of redemption pulled at him, sharper than any knife. "I'll do it." The man's expression softened, though his eyes remained distant. "Very well. Go to the edge of the woods tonight, when the moon is at its highest. Stand there and wait. The Hollow will come for you." Night had settled over Belgrave, thick and oppressive. The fog had not lifted. If anything, it had deepened, swallowing the town whole. Thomas stood at the edge of the woods, the path leading into the trees barely visible through the haze. He could hear the distant sound of something shifting within the underbrush, but when he turned to look, all he saw were shadows, stretching unnaturally in the pale moonlight. His breath came out in shallow gasps as he stood still, waiting. The trees loomed like dark sentinels around him, and for the first time he felt truly alone. There was no sound of life, no birds calling or insects buzzing. It was as if the world had gone still, holding its breath. The man at the inn had warned him. The hollow was not a place, but something more. A force, a presence. It didn't appear when you called for it, but when it decided you were ready. Thomas wasn't sure what that meant, but he had no choice. He had to see this through. His mind wandered back to the things he had done, the people he had hurt, the lives he had shattered. There was no way to undo it, no way to take back the cruelty, the carelessness. He had thought that running would make it all go away, but now, standing here in this forsaken town, he knew it was impossible. There was no escaping his sins. Not truly. A rustling sound broke through his thoughts, followed by a whisper, so faint that it was almost imperceptible. He turned, searching the darkness. The trees parted slightly, and in the distance, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and shrouded in a cloak of darkness, the fabric moving like smoke around her. Her face was hidden, but her presence seemed to command the very air, bending it around her. She moved with unnatural grace, as though the ground beneath her feet didn't quite touch her. Thomas felt his heart race, but he didn't run. He couldn't. He was frozen in place, drawn to her in a way he couldn't explain. The woman stopped a few feet away, her presence filling the space around him. "You've come," she said, her voice both soft and commanding, as if it was carried on the very wind. "I've been waiting. Are you the hollow?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. The woman laughed, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the trees like a distant echo. "No, I am its messenger. The hollow is not a thing, but an essence, a force that resides in all things. It watches, listens, and chooses those worthy enough to call upon it." Thomas swallowed hard. "I've made terrible mistakes. I need to make them right." The woman tilted her head, as if considering him. "And what are you willing to sacrifice to atone for your sins?" "The hollow does not give without taking." His chest tightened. He had no illusions about the cost. He had heard the stories. People who came to the hollow for redemption didn't leave the same. They never left whole. "I'll do whatever it takes," he said, though the words tasted like ash in his mouth. The woman's eyes, if they could be called eyes, for they seemed to be pools of darkness, focused on him. She stepped closer, her presence nearly overwhelming. "Then follow me," she whispered. She turned and began walking into the woods, her footsteps soundless. Thomas hesitated, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back, but he knew that there was no other choice. He had come this far. He had to face whatever was ahead. The path twisted deeper into the forest, where the trees seemed to grow closer together, their gnarled branches weaving into an almost impenetrable canopy. The air grew colder still, and the fog thickened, curling around them like a living thing. After what felt like hours, they came upon a clearing. In the center, there was an ancient stone altar, worn by time and the elements. The woman stopped beside it, her cloak swirling around her like smoke. "Place your hands on the stone," she instructed. "The hollow will speak to you then." Thomas did as she asked, his hands trembling as he touched the stone. It was smooth and cold, as though it had absorbed the chill of centuries. The moment his skin made contact, he felt a jolt of energy surge through him, sharp and painful. It was as if the very earth itself was alive, pulsing beneath his fingers. And then the voice came. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It didn't speak with words. It spoke directly into his mind, its presence both overwhelming and suffocating. "What is it you seek, Thomas?" The voice was like 100 whispers, blending together in a cacophony that made his skin crawl. He didn't know how to respond at first. What was he really asking for? Redemption? Forgiveness? Could he even hope for such things? I want to be free of my past, he said, his voice barely a whisper, barely even his own. I want to undo the wrongs I've done. The whispers swirled around him, pressing in on all sides, and the air seemed to grow colder still. For a moment, he felt as if he were drowning, the weight of his own sins sinking him deeper and deeper into the void. You wish to erase the pain, but the pain is what makes you whole, the voice responded. To sever the past is to sever yourself. What will you give in return? Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. His heart hammered in his chest. What would he give? He had nothing left, nothing of value. His soul, his life. I will give whatever it takes, he said, his voice rising in desperation. The ground beneath him trembled, and the woman's shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, looming over him. The voice responded once more, its tone heavier now, as though it had been waiting for this moment. Very well. Suddenly, the ground beneath him gave way, and he was falling, plunging into a darkness so complete that it suffocated him. There was no air, no light, only the crushing weight of something vast and ancient pressing against him from all sides. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. He was lying on the ground, his body aching as though it had been torn apart and put back together. The woman was gone, and the clearing was silent once more. But something was different. The air no longer felt cold, felt wrong. He stood up, his legs unsteady. A single thought echoed through his mind. The price had been paid. But what exactly had he lost? The forest around him had transformed. The once oppressive stillness had faded, replaced by an unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through the very earth beneath his feet. The trees stood tall but unfamiliar, their twisted limbs reaching toward the sky in unnatural angles. The fog, once dense and suffocating, had receded, but the air felt thick with something unspeakable, something waiting. Thomas blinked and looked around, trying to gather his bearings, but the clearing had shifted. The altar, once a stone relic of ancient rituals, was gone. In its place stood a darkened pool of water, its surface perfectly still, reflecting nothing but the dense night above. The water was black, as if it held the weight of all the sins in the world, and yet it seemed to call to him an invitation or a warning. He wasn't sure which. He stumbled toward it, his breath shallow, unsure of what he was supposed to do. Had the hollow granted his wish? Was this redemption, or had he simply traded one darkness for another? Look into it, a voice whispered, soft as the wind but clear as day. It was not the woman's voice, nor the hollow's. It was something else, something human. He turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the water, staring back at him with a silence so profound it pressed into his skull. But he did as the voice suggested. The moment his gaze met the black surface of the pool, the world around him blurred. The trees seemed to twist and bend, their shadows stretching unnaturally toward him, and the ground beneath his feet shifted like sand. The water rippled, disturbing the stillness and the reflections it held. His reflection began to change. At first, it was a simple distortion, like the water was reacting to the movement of his own eyes. But then the figure in the water began to speak. It wasn't his voice. It was distorted, layered, as though more than one being had found its way into his image. You think you've paid the price? The voice mocked him. You think you've given enough? Thomas recoiled, stumbling back, but his feet wouldn't move fast enough. The reflection in the water was shifting faster now, the eyes, his eyes, glowing with an unnatural light. You can't undo the past, Thomas. Not this time. Not ever. He pressed his hands against his ears, trying to block out the voice, but it only grew louder, more insistent. He looked at his hands. His skin was pale, unnaturally so, and the veins underneath seemed to pulse with a dark energy. The same energy that had surged through him when he touched the stone. It wasn't gone. It was still there, feeding off his fear. The figure in the water began to speak again, this time with a sharp, guttural tone, as though something monstrous was trying to break free. You've sacrificed everything, Thomas. But what if you were never meant to be redeemed? What if you've always been the monster? His heart hammered in his chest as his reflection twisted into something monstrous. His features warped, his face growing elongated, his skin darkening and cracking like old stone. His hands, once human, became gnarled and twisted, the nails lengthening into claws. The vision was too much to bear. Thomas turned away, gasping for air, his mind swirling in confusion and terror. He couldn't think. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees pushing forward as if they were alive, shaking with malicious energy. A laugh, low, cruel, and full of mocking joy, echoed around him. The woman appeared again, stepping from the shadows as though she had always been there, watching. Her cloak billowed, and her presence filled the air, suffocating him. "Did you really think the hollow could give you what you sought?" she asked, her voice heavy with amusement. "It doesn't grant wishes, Thomas. It forces you to confront what you are. You can't escape who you've been." Thomas's knees buckled beneath him, and he sank to the ground. He wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words wouldn't come. The weight of his sins pressed down on him harder than ever. He had hoped for peace. He had hoped to somehow outrun his past. But the hollow had shown him a truth he couldn't ignore. Redemption wasn't just impossible. It wasn't even an option. "What happens now?" Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. The woman bent down, her face now visible, though it was nothing like human. Her eyes were wide, black pits, empty and hollow, and her smile stretched unnaturally across her face, as if her skin could barely contain it. "Now," she said softly, "you face the cost of your sins. You are no longer human. You never were. You're nothing but a shadow now, and this forest. This place is where shadows come to die." Thomas felt the ground beneath him give way once again, but this time there was no fall. He was suspended, as though his very soul had been detached from his body. His body, twisted and unnatural, no longer felt like his own. He could feel it withering, losing its humanity piece by piece. "You can never leave here," the woman's voice whispered as she vanished into the shadows. "Not now. Not ever." The trees around him creaked and groaned as though they were alive, the very ground beneath his feet shifting like it had a mind of its own. He tried to move, but his limbs were heavy, sluggish. There was no escape from this place. The hollow had claimed him, not as a soul to be redeemed, but as one to be consumed. And as he fell into the darkness, his last thought was not of fear or regret. It was of how it had all started. The sins he thought he could outrun, the wish he thought could save him. But there was no salvation, only the hollow waiting, always waiting. Thomas felt as though the very essence of his being was being twisted and contorted, pulled from every direction by an unseen force. His limbs no longer obeyed him, and his senses were warped. His vision clouded with a darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. He was neither dead nor alive, floating in an endless void that felt like an eternity. Yet he could still hear the haunting whispers, the laughter that echoed through the shadows, gnawing at the edges of his mind. The air was thick with something foul, decay, rot, something ancient, and somewhere, deep in the void, he could sense the presence of something vast, something waiting. "Is this my punishment?" he murmured, his voice barely audible, lost in the suffocating darkness. There was no answer, only the silence, a silence that threatened to swallow him whole. But then, a soft light flickered in the distance, weak but persistent, like a star in an endless night. It pulled him toward it, a faint glimmer of hope in a sea of despair. For a moment, he thought it was the light of salvation, the thing he had been searching for all along. As he moved closer, his surroundings began to distort again. The shadows twisted, morphing into grotesque shapes, figures that seemed familiar, yet not quite. They were people, but not. Their faces were too blurred to recognize, their movements jerky and unnatural, as if they existed only in fragments of memory. And as they moved toward him, they reached out, their arms extending as though they wanted to touch him, to claim him. Thomas, a voice rasped from one of the figures, a whisper so cold it sent a shiver down his spine. He recoiled instinctively, but the figure stepped closer, its face now clear. It was a woman, a stranger, though her eyes were familiar, hauntingly so. He recognized the eyes. He recognized the pain in them. It was his mother, but she was wrong. She couldn't be here. "Mother," he croaked, his voice barely a whisper. Her eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow, a void that mirrored the darkness around him. "You never should have come," she said, her voice echoing in the space around them. Her face twisted into something grotesque, something that resembled a smile but was too cruel, too wrong to be anything but a mockery. "Please," Thomas begged, trying to move but finding himself unable to break free of the pull. I wanted to change. I wanted to make things right." Her smile only widened, her lips peeling back to reveal teeth that were too sharp, too numerous. "You can't change the past, Thomas. You can't undo what you've done. You can't outrun what you are." She reached out, her fingers long and cold, and touched his chest. The moment her hand made contact, his body erupted with pain. It wasn't physical. It was something deeper, something more profound. He felt it in his soul, in his very core. The weight of every mistake he had ever made, every person he had betrayed, every life he had ruined, came crashing down on him all at once. The pain was unbearable. It suffocated him. "Why?" he gasped, choking on the darkness. "Why can't I change?" "Because you've already paid the price," she whispered, her voice now dripping with venom. "And it's never enough." The darkness around him seemed to grow stronger. The figures closed in on him, their distorted faces now nothing more than empty vessels, their voices blending into a chorus of regret, guilt, and despair. They screamed at him in a language he couldn't understand, their accusations and condemnations cutting through him like 1,000 knives. As they reached for him, pulling him deeper into the abyss, he realized there was no escape, no redemption, no hope. The Hollow had never been about offering a chance for salvation. It had always been a prison, a place where lost souls were kept to rot, to wither, to fade into nothingness. The wish, the desire for redemption, it had all been a lie. And now Thomas understood. He had traded his soul for nothing. And the cost, the true cost, was far greater than he had ever imagined. The light, the small glimmer of hope he had seen, faded into the distance, swallowed by the encroaching darkness. His mother's form disintegrated, replaced by the inhuman shapes of the creatures who had once been the people of the town. They were everywhere now, surrounding him, their eyes empty and accusing, their voices lost in the ever-growing chorus of suffering. Thomas couldn't scream. He couldn't even move. He was nothing now, nothing but a shadow among shadows. The Hollow had claimed him, and in the end, there was no redemption, only the never-ending emptiness of its embrace. The darkness was no longer oppressive. It was not simply the absence of light. It had become a presence of its own, alive, suffocating, yet strangely calming. Thomas's senses, dulled by the sheer force of the Hollow, were beginning to numb. He no longer felt the physical pain, but there was something worse, an emotional void, a hollowness deep within him that stretched infinitely, as though the very nature of his existence had been consumed by this place. He had stopped struggling. There was nothing left to fight. But then, amidst the encroaching void, a figure appeared. It wasn't like the others, shapeless, grotesque, twisted. This one had form, a silhouette standing in sharp contrast to the surrounding blackness. It was a man, tall and imposing, his features hidden in shadows, his presence magnetic. Even in this endless sea of despair, Thomas could feel a sense of something, authority, power, radiating from him. "Thomas," the man said, his voice deep and echoing, as though it reverberated through the very walls of the Hollow itself. Thomas's eyes widened. He couldn't place it, but something about this figure felt familiar. A remnant from his past, or a creation of the Hollow. It didn't matter. He didn't care anymore. "Who are you?" Thomas rasped, his voice hoarse, a mere whisper against the silence. He wasn't even sure if he truly wanted to know. The man smiled, though it was a smile that never reached his eyes. A guide, a fellow traveler, if you will. Though unlike you, I have chosen this path. And I have no intention of leaving. Thomas's mind churned with the words. A guide? A fellow traveler? He couldn't understand. He could barely grasp the concept of what he was even experiencing right now. Why are you here? Thomas asked, struggling to form the question through his confusion. The man's smile grew wider. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow, as though savoring the moment. You've been searching for redemption. That's why you came here, isn't it? To fix what you've broken, to undo what cannot be undone. He paused, as though testing the weight of his words. But redemption is an illusion. Do you really think you deserve it? After all you've done? Thomas's heart thudded painfully in his chest. The words stung, but they also felt oddly familiar. He had heard this before, hadn't he? That whisper in the dark, that voice that haunted him, the voice that questioned his every move. But now, here in the hollow, it was different. It was sharper, clearer. It wasn't a distant accusation. It was a direct challenge. Thomas swallowed, his throat dry. I never meant for things to end up like this. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I thought I could fix it. The man let out a low, almost pitying chuckle. You really believe that? After everything? No, Thomas. You've made your choices. And now, like all who come here, you'll face the consequences. Thomas recoiled, but the hollow seemed to tighten around him, holding him in place, trapping him in a cage of his own making. The man stepped closer, his presence growing heavier with each movement, like the weight of an unspoken truth. Do you know why you're here? Do you know why the hollow called you? Thomas's mind was racing. He didn't have the answers. He never had the answers. All he knew was that this place, this godforsaken town, had drawn him in, had fed him with lies wrapped in promises of salvation. Thomas trailed off, the words stuck in his throat. Because you're weak, the man finished for him. Because you're nothing but a pawn in a game that's much older than you. The hollow has no need for redemption. It thrives on suffering, on the agony of those who seek what they can never have. And you, Thomas, are one of its many victims. Thomas's chest tightened as the full weight of the man's words settled into his bones. A pawn. That's all he was. He had thought he could change, thought he could make things right. But it was too late. He was already tangled in the web, a part of the hollow's unyielding grip. The man's voice softened, almost like a whisper now, as he leaned closer. I can offer you something if you want it. A choice, Thomas. A chance to escape this place. But you must understand the price. Nothing comes without cost. And this cost is something you will have to live with forever. Thomas's pulse quickened. He could feel the urgency in the man's voice, the weight of his words. A choice, a chance to escape. It sounded impossible, too good to be true. But then again, hadn't everything about this place been an illusion? What was real? And if the hollow was feeding on his suffering, what was the point of struggling anymore? Escape, Thomas repeated, his voice trembling. What do I have to do? The man's eyes gleamed with something dark, something almost sadistic. Nothing you haven't already done. All you have to do is make a choice. A simple one. All you need to do is let go. Thomas blinked, confused. Let go. The man nodded. Let go of everything. Your regrets, your guilt, your pain, your need for redemption. All of it. Only then can you leave this place. The words settled into Thomas's mind like poison. Let go. Could he? After everything he had been through, could he truly release himself from it all? From the guilt that gnawed at him? From the memories of those he had hurt? No, Thomas whispered, his voice weak. I can't. I can't just let it all go. I want to change. I want to make it right. The man's smile faltered. You think you have that choice? You think the hollow cares about your redemption? It doesn't, Thomas. It only wants your suffering. It wants you to break, to let go. That's the price. And if you refuse, you'll stay here forever, caught in an endless cycle of your own damnation. The man's form began to flicker, his edges blurring, as though he were fading into the very darkness that surrounded them. Make your choice, Thomas. Let go and you can escape, or hold on and remain here. With that, the figure vanished, leaving Thomas alone in the dark. The hollow was silent once more, but in the silence, Thomas could still feel it. The presence, the weight of the choice he had to make. Would he let go and accept the consequences? Or would he cling to his past, to his guilt, and remain trapped forever? The choice was his, but the weight of it, the unbearable weight, felt like it would crush him before he could even decide. The darkness pressed in around Thomas like a suffocating shroud, its weight pulling at the very core of his being. The figure, the guide, or whatever he had been, was gone, but his words lingered in the air, reverberating in Thomas's mind like an echo that refused to fade. Let go. Let go of everything. The guilt, the regret, the ache of all the wrongs he had committed. Could he truly sever the ties that bound him to his past, to the torment that had followed him into this forsaken place? He clenched his fists, his nails digging into the palms of his hands. His body trembled, not from the cold, but from the intensity of the decision that lay before him. Let go. The hollow had promised escape if he did, but at what cost? Could he truly erase everything he had done, every life he had touched, for better or worse? No, it wasn't that simple. The images flooded his mind unbidden. Faces, the ones he had hurt, the ones he had abandoned. His sister, her last words echoing in his ears, the look of betrayal in her eyes. His father's disappointed gaze. The people in the town he had failed. He had done terrible things in his life, things he could never undo. Could he truly let all of it go and simply walk away? What kind of person would he become if he did? But the hollow was not a place for mercy, for second chances. It was a place of torment. And yet, somewhere deep within him, a voice whispered, a dark, tempting voice, that perhaps there was peace in surrender, perhaps in giving up the pain, in letting go of all the weight of the past. There would be nothing left to haunt him, nothing left to hurt him. He closed his eyes, trying to block out the rising tide of thoughts, the memories that clawed at him relentless. There was no escape from them. No matter how hard he tried to outrun them, they always followed, a shadow on his soul. A flash of movement caught his attention, something shifting in the periphery of his vision. When he turned his head, the figure appeared again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the same man, the guide, but a woman pale and cold, with eyes as dark as the void around them. Her face was twisted in pain, a silent scream frozen on her lips. She hovered in the dark, her body flickering in and out of focus like a broken mirror. Thomas, her voice came, though her lips didn't move. It was a whisper, but it was everywhere, echoing in his mind, filling the space like an insistent, cruel melody. You think you can escape it? You think you can outrun what you've done? Thomas took a step back, instinctively, his heart thundering in his chest. What are you? He whispered, though he wasn't sure if the question was for her or for himself. He didn't want to know. He didn't want any more torment. The woman's eyes glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I am what you've made me, she said, her voice soft and mocking. I am the consequence. The price. Thomas felt a shiver run down his spine. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. What price? He asked, his voice barely a whisper. She stepped forward, and in the fleeting moment before her presence became overwhelming, she gave him a bitter smile. You don't remember, do you? But I do. I remember all of it. Every moment. The air grew heavier, the space pressing in on him as though the walls of the hollow were closing in. His chest tightened, the weight of the woman's presence suffocating. Let me show you, she murmured, and then everything snapped. The ground beneath his feet shattered like glass, and Thomas was falling. No, he wasn't falling. He was being pulled. A darkness surrounded him, a crushing void that swallowed him whole. Then, suddenly, he was no longer in the hollow. He was back in the town he had left behind. the one that had become a prison of its own. He stood at the edge of the street, but it was empty, not a single person in sight. Only the wind howled through the deserted streets, carrying with it the faint smell of decay. His eyes scanned the familiar buildings, the old, crumbling structures that had once been full of life. But now they stood silent, abandoned. The woman's voice echoed again, colder now, sharper. "Do you remember this place, Thomas? Do you remember what you did?" He turned. She stood at the far end of the street, her figure silhouetted against the moonlight, but her eyes were the only things that remained clear, black, empty. Thomas's stomach twisted. His breath caught in his throat. He could hear it now. Footsteps, not just his own, others. He turned again and his body froze. There, standing in the doorway of a broken building, was the figure of a child. A little girl, her face pale, her expression vacant. It was Alice, his sister. "Alice," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. But Alice didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head, a twisted smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Then she began to speak, but the words came out wrong, distorted, garbled, like they had been torn apart and sewn back together. "Why did you leave me?" she asked, her voice thin and broken. "Alice, Thomas's words faltered. His chest tightened, and he found it hard to breathe. "I needed you, Thomas." Her voice echoed around him, louder now. "I needed you, and you left." Thomas's legs began to move of their own accord. He didn't want to walk towards her, but his body was compelled, his steps dragging him closer to her like a puppet on strings. "I'm sorry," he whispered, though the words felt empty. "I didn't mean to. I never meant to leave you." But Alice didn't hear him. Or maybe she did. Maybe she was beyond hearing now. She reached out, her hand pale and skeletal. And in that moment, Thomas realized the truth, the price he had paid. The town wasn't empty because of some random calamity. It was empty because of him, his choices, his abandonment. Alice's smile twisted into something horrific. "You left me to die, and now you'll never escape." Before Thomas could react, her hand was on him, cold, icy, and in that instant, everything he had done, every mistake he had made, came crashing down on him. The guilt, the shame, the unbearable weight of the consequences, all piled on top of him. And then, everything was still. The silence that followed was unbearable, like the calm before an inevitable storm. Thomas stood there, frozen in the grip of his sister's touch, unable to move, unable to breathe. The world around him seemed to distort, as though it were stretching and pulling, unraveling at the seams. But all he could focus on were Alice's eyes, black and endless, the void within them threatening to swallow him whole. "Why did you leave me, Thomas?" Her voice was a low whisper, a haunting, insistent echo that bounced off the walls of his mind. "Why did you let me suffer alone?" He wanted to answer. He wanted to say something, anything to explain himself, to make her understand. But no words came. The guilt was too overwhelming, a tidal wave of regret crashing over him, drowning out his thoughts. He had left her. He had abandoned her when she needed him most. And in the end, she had paid the price for his neglect. Her hand tightened around his wrist, her fingers cold and unyielding, and the pain that coursed through him was not physical but something far deeper, something rooted in the very marrow of his soul. "I tried, Alice," he finally managed to say, his voice trembling. "I tried to come back. I didn't mean to." The words faltered, dying in his throat as Alice's twisted smile grew wider, her features warping, becoming more grotesque with each passing moment. She wasn't his sister anymore. She was something else entirely, something broken, something beyond saving. "You didn't try hard enough," she hissed, her voice now sharp and venomous. "You never do." Thomas stumbled back, trying to break free from her grasp, but his legs felt like lead. The town around him began to shift, its crumbling buildings warping into monstrous shapes, twisting and contorting in ways that defied reality. The wind howled louder, a cacophony of whispers filling the air, each one carrying the voices of the lost, of the people he had failed. The darkness around him deepened, and suddenly, the ground beneath his feet gave way. He fell once more, the cold void swallowing him, pulling him down into an endless abyss. The scream that tore from his throat was swallowed by the darkness, unheard, unacknowledged. When Thomas's eyes finally opened again, he found himself standing at the edge of the town. Only this time, it wasn't the town he remembered. It was different, distorted, a reflection of the place he had once known, but twisted beyond recognition. The buildings loomed tall, their windows dark and empty. The streets stretched out before him like a labyrinth, filled with shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. And there, at the center of the town, was the hollow. It loomed like a blackened, gaping wound in the world, its surface slick and reflective, as though it were a mirror to some deeper, darker part of his soul. Thomas could feel it, feel the weight of its presence, the way it seemed to beckon to him, urging him forward. But as he took a step closer, a voice echoed from the shadows, a voice that chilled him to his core. "You cannot escape, Thomas." He froze. The voice was familiar, too familiar. It was the guide, the same man who had led him through the hollow before. But now, his form was a blur, his shape flickering like a broken flame. "Why are you here?" Thomas demanded, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "What do you want from me?" The guide's form solidified, and the twisted, hollow smile that stretched across his face was unsettling. "What do you think I want? You've been given a choice, Thomas. A choice that no one can truly make. Let go or suffer the consequences." Thomas's heart pounded in his chest, and he took another step forward. He couldn't stand this place, couldn't stand the crushing weight of his past bearing down on him from every direction. He needed to end it. He needed to let go, as the hollow had promised. But as he drew closer to the gaping wound in the world, something inside him screamed to stop. "You think you can undo what you've done?" The guide's voice grew colder, sharper. "You think you can erase the past? You are not free. Not here. Not anywhere." Thomas stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stared into the blackened mirror of the hollow. His reflection stared back at him, but it wasn't the man he had known. It wasn't the man he was trying to become. No, it was the man he had been, the man who had made all those terrible choices, the man who had caused so much pain. His face was twisted with regret, eyes hollow, cheeks gaunt. The hollow wasn't offering redemption. It wasn't offering peace. It was offering something far more insidious, a chance to confront himself. "You can never escape who you are," the guide whispered, his voice filled with a cruel finality. "Not in this world. Not in any world." The mirror-like surface of the hollow rippled, and Thomas found himself standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the town he had abandoned. Below, the twisted, broken bodies of the people he had hurt lay sprawled across the streets. Alice, his father, the others, they were all there, trapped in the same cycle of suffering, forever doomed to live in the reflection of his actions. And then, a soft voice, no, a whisper, floated through the air, barely audible over the howling wind. "Why did you leave me, Thomas?" It was Alice again. Her voice was weak, hollow, filled with a sorrow that seemed to seep into his bones. "I'm sorry," he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. "I didn't mean to. I didn't—" But the words fell flat, swallowed by the void. There was no forgiveness here, no redemption, no escape, only the endless reflection of his own guilt, stretching into eternity. The air thickened as Thomas stood before the hollow, feeling the weight of every decision he had ever made pressing down on him like an unbearable burden. The world around him trembled, as though the very fabric of reality was about to snap. The whispers of the lost souls grew louder, drowning out his thoughts, their voices a cacophony of rage and sorrow, accusing him, condemning him. "You can't undo it." The guide's voice slithered through the chaos, cold and final. "There's no redemption here. There's no coming back." Thomas's mind raced, each step forward heavier than the last. He was trapped in a nightmare, a reflection of his worst fears, his darkest regrets. The hollow was not a place for forgiveness. It was a place for reckoning, and it demanded payment. "You've seen the truth," the guide continued, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You know what you did. You know what you failed to do. You are not innocent. You never were." The hollow pulsed, its surface shimmering as if it were alive, its reflections shifting like the ghosts of his past. Alice's face appeared in the mirror once more, her eyes dark, filled with an emptiness that echoed his own despair. "Do you want to save yourself?" The guide's voice whispered, filled with malice. "Do you think that you deserve to?" Thomas's heart raced. The question lingered in the air, a cruel temptation. What was he really seeking? Forgiveness? Redemption? Or was it just an escape from the suffocating weight of his guilt? "No," Thomas said, his voice shaking. "I don't deserve anything, but I can't stay here." The guide's laugh echoed, hollow and cruel. "You can't leave, Thomas. You never could." Thomas's pulse quickened as the hollow's surface began to distort, swirling in on itself like a black hole, pulling everything toward its center. The reflections of the people he had failed twisted, distorting into grotesque, inhuman shapes, their faces contorted in pain and fury. "Look at them," the guide sneered, gesturing toward the reflections. "Your victims, your failures. Do you think you can walk away from this? Do you think you can run from who you are?" Thomas trembled, his vision swimming. His eyes darted from the twisted figures to the reflection of himself, his face staring back, no longer recognizable, consumed by his own darkness. He wanted to turn away. He wanted to scream, to beg for an escape. But there was no escape. Not here. Not from this. "You've made your choice," the guide's voice intoned, its presence looming over Thomas like an oppressive weight. "There's only one way out. But know this, Thomas. Whatever choice you make, there is no going back." The ground beneath his feet began to crumble, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt his body lifting, suspended between the terrifying black void of the hollow and the crumbling world around him. The choice was his. "Please," Thomas whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, I want to end this. I want to make it right." The guide's eyes gleamed with a cruel satisfaction. "You can't make it right, but you can choose how it ends." And then, a figure emerged from the darkness, the faint outline of a woman, her face obscured by shadows. Her presence was cold, like a grave, and her very being seemed to radiate a sense of finality. It was Alice, but she was not the Alice he had known. She was something far worse, something born of his own guilt and torment. Her eyes were hollow, black as the night, her mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. She reached out, her hand cold and unyielding, and Thomas felt an overwhelming compulsion to reach for it. "No," he whispered, backing away, his body trembling. "No, I can't." But Alice's voice, soft and insistent, filled his mind, drowning out everything else. "Take my hand, Thomas," she whispered, her voice laced with an eerie calm. "Come with me. We can be together again. You've paid the price. You deserve this." For a moment, Thomas wavered. The thought of being with Alice, of escaping this nightmare, of atoning for his sins, it was too tempting, too easy. But as he stared into her eyes, he saw it. The truth. The price for his redemption had never been forgiveness. It had never been about making things right. The hollow didn't care about that. It only cared about the suffering he had caused, the suffering he had inflicted on others to appease his own desires. The only redemption here was eternal torment, an endless cycle of regret and pain. And so Thomas made his choice. "No," he said, his voice trembling but firm. "I can't take your hand. I can't let you pull me into the darkness with you." With those words, the world around him shattered. The hollow collapsed in on itself, the world spiraling into oblivion as Thomas was torn from the nightmare. But there was no escape, no salvation, only the knowledge that he had chosen to confront his sins, to face the consequences of his actions. But the cost was far greater than he could have ever imagined. In the final moments before everything vanished, Thomas saw it. Alice's face, twisted and broken, staring at him with eyes full of hatred. Her voice echoed one last time, filled with the same sorrowful accusation that had haunted him throughout his journey. "You could have saved me," she whispered, her voice fading into the void. "But you didn't." And then the darkness claimed him. Thomas was never seen again. The town remained a hollow shell, its broken remnants scattered across a desolate landscape. The hollow still stood, its surface reflecting the faces of those who had passed through it. Lost souls, condemned to repeat their mistakes for eternity. And somewhere, deep within the darkness, Thomas's name echoed, forever trapped in the void of his own making. Journal of Henry Calloway, February 22nd, 2024. I can't shake the feeling that I'm being watched. The house creaks at night, a low, resonant groan that comes from deep within its bones. It's not the sort of sound a house makes. I know it. I've lived here for over a decade, and I've never heard it before. It's like something else has taken up residence. I can't explain it, but the air feels heavier now, as if it carries an unseen weight that presses against my chest. Last night, I heard a sound that sent me spiraling into a panic. It started softly, a faint rustling, as though someone was shuffling through the living room. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't move, my limbs frozen as I strained to listen. The noise came again, this time closer, like something was dragging itself across the floor. I got up and crept into the hallway, flashlight in hand, only to find nothing but the silence of the house, deep and suffocating. February 25th, 2024. Sleep eludes me, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. I started recording everything on my phone, every creak, every shuffle. I need proof, something to hold on to when doubt begins to gnaw at my sanity. The microphones pick up faint sounds, whispers that fade as soon as I turn my head. I play them back, the quiet murmurs filling the room, and my skin crawls. Sometimes I hear what sounds like a child's laughter, other times, the deep rasp of an adult voice, whispering words I cannot make out. I called a shaman last night. I'm not sure why. His voice on the phone was clipped, suspicious, as if he knew I was already unraveling. "You've brought something here," he said. "It thrives on fear. You must act before it takes you." The weight of his words sits heavily on my mind. I don't understand what it is, but it feels real, tangible. I set up cameras in the living room and hallway today, pointing them at the corners where shadows seem to collect. The little red lights blink like eyes watching me, waiting. March 1st, 2024. I spend the day watching the camera feeds on my laptop, squinting at the grainy footage, looking for movement, looking for anything. My hands are always shaking now, and it's hard to keep the tremble out of my voice when I speak. I think I see shadows darting at the edge of the frame, but when I pause the video and lean in, there's nothing there. Just the dark, empty hallway and the quiet hum of the camera. The sounds have become louder. Last night, I heard what sounded like a dragging footstep just outside my bedroom door. It was slow, deliberate, and I couldn't move as the air seemed to freeze around me. When I mustered the courage to look, I found nothing but the empty hallway, bathed in the flickering light from the camera. But the silence that followed was worse, an emptiness that pressed against my ears. I've started talking to the shadows now, as if they might reply. I know it's madness, but it's the only way I can convince myself that I'm still in control. March 4th, 2024. Today, I set up more cameras and microphones. I placed one in the attic, though I fear what I might find there. The house feels alive, like it's shifting when I'm not looking. I can't tell if I'm seeing things or if my mind is finally breaking under the strain. There was a moment this afternoon when I was sure I saw a figure in the hallway, standing just out of the reach of the camera's light. It was tall, its limbs bent in a way that was almost human but not quite. It moved, and the feed flickered, the screen tearing like paper. My heart slammed against my ribs, and I shut my eyes for a moment, afraid to look back. When I did, the figure was gone, but the air felt colder, as though someone had walked through it. I called the shaman again, my voice cracking as I asked him for help. He came with a dark, worried expression, muttering under his breath. He walked through the house, stopping by each camera as though expecting them to turn on him. His eyes darted nervously, and he whispered something in an ancient language, words that seemed to make the walls shiver. "You've awakened something," he said, eyes wide with fear. "It's in your mind now. Feeds on you." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in front of the camera feeds, eyes bleary, fingers tracing the edges of the desk. The whispering returned, and this time it was louder, almost as if it were speaking to me. I couldn't make out the words, but it was close enough to feel the chill against my neck. March 7th, 2024. I can't keep up with it. The sound, the movement, the feeling of eyes watching me from the corners of the room. It's all too much. Last night, I stood at the end of the hallway, holding my breath as the faint sound of scraping drew closer. The camera feed was glitching, the screen blinking like a pulse. I thought I saw something moving in the dark, a shape with sharp edges that moved too fast for my eyes to follow. My mind is collapsing. I've stopped leaving the house. I don't know how long it's been since I've seen the sun, but it doesn't matter. The house is all I have left, and I'm afraid it's all I'll have until the end. March 10th, 2024. I put a microphone in the living room to pick up more sounds. I told myself it was for the evidence, but I know now that it's for me. I need to hear the sound, to know it's there, to remind myself I'm not alone in this. The shaman's warning repeats in my head. It thrives on fear. The more I listen, the more it grows, taking form in the dark. It's in the walls, the floorboards, and the shadows. When I close my eyes, I can feel it moving just out of reach, fingers brushing against my skin, pulling me back into the darkness. March 14th, 2024. There's a sound now that I can't explain. A low thud that comes in sets of 3, like footsteps, deliberate and slow. It's as if whatever is here is pacing, watching, waiting for me to move. I record everything, the sounds, the glimpses of shadows, the way the camera feed goes black for a second as though it's blinking. Last night, I walked to the attic, my mind a fog of fear and exhaustion. The door creaked as I opened it, the darkness inside swallowing the light of my flashlight. And then I heard it. A wet, snuffling sound, close and almost familiar. My breath caught as I took a step forward. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something that made my skin crawl. I raised the flashlight, heart pounding, to find nothing. The beam flickered as I strained to see into the pitch-black attic, the corners of my vision dancing with shadows that shifted and swayed. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the thud of my heartbeat in my ears. I took a step further into the darkness, my pulse quickening with every movement. But then it came, soft at first, almost imperceptible. A rustling sound, like something brushing against the old, wooden beams. My hands trembled, the flashlight slipping slightly before I tightened my grip. I was breathing too fast, too loud, my chest heaving as if I were on the edge of an abyss. "Hello," I whispered, the sound small and pathetic in the dark. The rustling stopped, replaced by an eerie stillness. I waited, straining to hear anything that would prove I wasn't losing my mind. The seconds stretched into minutes, the air tightening around me, cold and sharp as a blade. Then, from somewhere behind me, there was a loud crack, a sound like a branch snapping under the weight of something heavy. I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the attic in frantic sweeps. Nothing, just the silence, now heavy with a malicious intent. I stumbled backward, tripping over an old trunk and sprawling onto the dusty floor. A guttural growl, low and rough, rose from the shadows behind me. My throat went dry as I felt eyes fix on me, piercing through the darkness. My body refused to move, paralyzed by the realization that whatever was in this house had cornered me. I managed to turn and push myself up, crawling toward the attic door as the growl turned into a series of sharp, wet snuffles. I glanced back one last time, and in that instant, I saw it. A shape moving in the dark, the eyes catching the faint light in a glimmer of feral hunger. I didn't dare take another step. The door felt miles away, my limbs too weak to respond. The whispers, the dragging footsteps, the glances at the cameras. All of it had led me here, to the edge of a madness that threatened to consume me. The growl came again, but closer, and I knew I had only moments before whatever haunted this house tore through the space between us. March 18th, 2024. I don't know how long I've been trapped in this cycle of terror. The days bleed into each other, marked only by the muted glow of my laptop screen and the scattered pages of my journal. The noise has escalated, becoming a cacophony of shuffles, dragging footsteps, and the bone-deep feeling of being watched. I've stopped trying to sleep. It only makes the whispers stronger, the shadows bolder. Today, I dared to remove the blanket from the attic door and peeked inside, half expecting to find nothing but the dust and memories of a forgotten space. Instead, I found the trap door open, swaying as if disturbed, and beneath it, a long, dark void. The growling was there, deep and low, more animalistic than before. My pulse quickened, and I backed away, my mind splintering under the weight of the unknown. I set up another camera, a new angle that showed the entire hallway leading to the attic. If I was going to be trapped, I wanted to see it coming. But it was the sound from the hallway that drew me forward. A soft patter of feet, rapid and uneven, like something sprinting just out of view. I watched the footage, eyes widening as I saw the shadows move, bending and snapping in impossible ways as something skittered past. It paused just long enough to be caught on the camera. Something with ragged limbs and a body that seemed to melt into the darkness. It didn't have a face, but I felt it watching me, a hungry stare that clawed at my sanity. I knew then, with absolute certainty, that the house would not let me leave. March 22nd, 2024. The shaman's words echoed in my mind. It thrives on fear. I have given it what it wants, haven't I? I don't know if I have the strength to fight anymore. The footsteps are now in the rooms below me, racing through the walls as if taunting me, daring me to move. I wonder if it's been here all along, hidden in the crevices, only now revealing itself as it takes me apart piece by piece. I reached out, grabbing a knife from the kitchen counter and pressed it against my palm, the sharp edge biting into my skin. My own blood welled up, hot and bright, a reminder that I am still alive, still here. It should have been enough to ground me, but the laughter that followed, the sound of a child's mirth coming from the dark, drove me further over the edge. It wasn't enough. March 25th, 2024. I think I'm losing my mind. The whispers are clearer now, forming words that come from the other side of reason, speaking in a language I've never heard but somehow understand. They tell me to follow the sound, to surrender to what waits in the shadows. The cameras now show something moving, darting between frames so quickly that I can barely catch a glimpse. And then, in a moment of silence so profound it hurt, I heard a knock. Soft, hesitant, almost polite, came from the front door. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at it, the final barrier between me and whatever lay on the other side. But I knew that I would have to open it, that my mind could not take this any longer. The last entry on my journal was hurried, my handwriting a wild scrawl that mirrored the madness gripping me. It's here. I have to open the door. The air in the room felt charged, almost electric, as if the very atoms were vibrating in anticipation. My hands trembled as I pushed myself up from the chair, each step toward the door a battle against the mounting terror that clawed at my chest. I had placed the cameras, the microphones, the protective charms, everything I could think of to ward off whatever malevolent force had taken residence in my home. But none of it had worked. The whispers, the shadows, the cold breath that caressed the back of my neck in the night, it had only gotten worse. The knock came again, a little louder, a little more insistent. I wiped my damp palms on my jeans, took a deep breath, and reached for the doorknob. The wood felt rough and splintered beneath my touch, like it had aged 100 years overnight. I hesitated, my mind flooding with doubts. What if it was just a trick? What if it was nothing? But deep down, I knew better. The noises had grown sharper, more defined. I'd heard whispers that seemed to call my name, voices that weren't human, as if the house itself had developed a voice, a sinister, rasping whisper that spoke of things I didn't dare to comprehend. And then, with a creak that seemed to echo through my bones, I twisted the knob and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, bathed in the pale, flickering glow of the old light bulb at the far end. Dust particles floated lazily in the stagnant air, and the silence that met me was almost deafening. But there was something else, something behind that silence. A presence, palpable and sinister, as if the space around me were alive with 1,000 unseen eyes. "Hello!" My voice sounded strange, thin, almost swallowed by the room. No response, just the dull hum of the fluorescent bulb overhead. I stepped outside, letting the door creak shut behind me, and strained to listen. That's when I heard it. A soft thumping, rhythmic, like a heartbeat, coming from above. My eyes shot upward to the attic door. I had avoided it for weeks, ever since the sounds first started. It was like a wound in the house, a scar that pulsed and shifted whenever I looked at it. The thumping grew louder, almost desperate now, and then a sudden silence. I froze, every muscle in my body tensed. My gaze shifted to the floor, where a thin line of shadow crept out from beneath the attic door. It shifted, moved, and then retreated back into the dark. I backed away, my heart slamming against my ribs, the blood roaring in my ears. I reached out, fumbling for my phone, the screen illuminating the terror-stricken face staring back at me. My breath came in short, shallow bursts as I dialed the number for the shaman, the one who had spoken of curses and dark, buried secrets. It rang once, twice. The line went dead. A noise behind me, a soft scrape, the shuffle of something moving across the floor. I spun around, eyes darting to the hallway. The kitchen, bathed in the dim glow of the moon, was a portrait of haunting emptiness. But then I saw it. A shadow moving, too fast, too fluid, vanishing in the space between the light and dark. I backed toward the door, my breathing ragged, the phone slipping from my fingers. My mind screamed at me to run, but my legs betrayed me, frozen in place. The shadow reappeared, now a little clearer, moving across the wall like a dark stain that never settled. I was no longer sure what was real and what was a hallucination. The hours blurred together, the days fused into a nightmarish cycle. The darkness, the whispers, and the sounds from the attic grew louder, more violent, like an angry, undying thing trying to claw its way out. And then, in the thin light that barely crept through the curtains, I heard the sound again. A knock, soft but insistent, came from the front door. My pulse quickened as I stepped forward, this time not to open it but to stand behind it, my hands shaking as they reached for the lock. My mind raced through every possibility. A trick, an intruder, the thing that had been haunting me, the thing I had become. But my eyes locked on the shadow creeping beneath the door, and I realized, in that moment of stark, mind-ripping clarity, that I would never be the same again. The thing behind that door wasn't just my tormentor. It was my fate. I had to open it. I had to know what was waiting, the final, horrifying truth. The knocking grew louder, faster, as if whatever was on the other side was pressing against the wood, desperate to break through. With a sudden burst of resolve, I flung the door open, and what I saw made my mind splinter, shattered by the sight of a creature I could not name, eyes glistening with an almost human glee, as if it knew it had one. I didn't scream. I didn't have time. The shadow pounced, and my vision went black. The next time I woke, I was not in my home. I was in a hospital bed, the sterile lights and the mechanical beeping drowning out the distant echo of a familiar scurrying sound. The morning light was dim, filtered through the pale curtains drawn over the window. The walls of the hospital room were painted a sterile white, so bright they seemed to hum with a disquieting sense of artificiality. I could feel the dull ache in my head, the sharp sting of dried blood crusted near my temple. I reached up instinctively, feeling the jagged edges of a gash that had yet to heal. A nurse walked in, her expression a mask of practiced calm, eyes darting away from mine as she checked the 4 drip hanging by my bed. I wanted to speak, to tell her about the thing, to scream that it had followed me here, but my voice cracked, the words tangled and lost in the dryness of my throat. "Rest," she said, her tone a soft command. "You need to regain your strength." But I couldn't rest. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, that something lurked just beyond the walls of this sterile prison. Every time I closed my eyes, the sound came back, the soft padding of feet, the scrabbling claws against wood, the rustle of unseen movement. The creature, the shadow, whatever it had been, it was here. I could feel it in the silence, in the sharp, cold breaths that seemed to creep across my skin. I reached out for the journal I had clutched so desperately before, now sitting in a plastic bin by my bed, its pages crumpled and torn from my last fevered entry. I flipped it open, hands trembling, and began to read. My own words, raw and scrawled, jumped out at me. "It's here. Followed me. It waits in the dark." I turned the page, scanning the disjointed phrases, the notes I had made in the grip of my paranoia. Words like shadows, voices, and the attic stood out, but one line in particular made me pause. A single sentence that made the blood drain from my face. "It's not what you think." I dropped the journal as if it had burned me, the thought flickering in my mind like a cruel echo. Had I made all of it up? Was it just the stress, the isolation, the relentless torment of the house driving me to this edge of sanity? But no, there was no denying the bruises, the deep scratches on my arms that stung when I touched them, the remnants of claw marks that had not come from any man-made source. The nurse noticed my agitation, her eyes flicking to the journal on the bed. "Are you all right?" she asked cautiously. I nodded, barely trusting my voice to respond. "I need to know. I need to understand what happened. It's not just in my head." The nurse's eyes softened, but a strange flicker passed across her face before she turned away to check the monitors. A sharp, metallic click split the air, and I looked down to see a small red light blinking from the corner of the room. A camera that I hadn't noticed before. It was recording. The sound of claws skittered across the floor just outside my room, a familiar, rhythmic tapping that sent an icy shiver down my spine. My pulse quickened as I strained to hear, ears filled with the roar of blood and the stutter of my breathing. The nurse turned back to me, but her face had changed. It was no longer the friendly mask I had come to expect. It was something hollow, eyes too wide, mouth stretched into a thin, unnatural smile. She whispered, "It's waiting." Before I could react, the camera in the corner shut off, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. The door creaked open, and I braced myself for what came next. The door opened slowly, and in the dim light, I saw the silhouette of a figure that was all too familiar. The nurse stood there, but she was no longer the woman who had offered comfort. She was the creature from my house, hollow-eyed and grotesque, a parody of humanity. But as my heart pounded and I opened my mouth to scream, the room fell into silence, and the apparition faded into the mundane reality of my hospital room. The door creaked shut, and I fell back against the pillows, gasping for air. My body shook, the tremors spreading like a fever as my mind struggled to grasp what was real. "Mr. Calloway?" A calm voice cut through my disoriented haze. I looked up to see Dr. Patel, a middle-aged man with sharp features and an unreadable expression, standing at the foot of my bed. He adjusted the cuffs of his white coat, his eyes fixed on me with a look that was at once knowing and clinical. What happened?" My voice cracked, raw from both the scream I hadn't released and the days of stress and sleeplessness. Dr. Patel's gaze softened, and he exchanged a quick look with the nurse who had entered behind him. She held a clipboard, her eyes no longer hollow but full of a restrained sympathy. "Mr. Calloway, you were found in your home, injured and unresponsive. Animal control was called after neighbors reported strange noises coming from the house." A sick realization twisted my gut as I listened. Animal control? My mind reeled back to the noise, the scratching, the thumping, the ever-present tapping that had kept me up at night. The fear, the hallucinations. Had it all been the result of something so mundane? My thoughts jumbled together in a cacophony of disbelief. Dr. Patel continued, "We found signs of a raccoon infestation. It seems you were attacked at some point, possibly in a state of panic. The injuries on your arms and torso were consistent with animal claws. It must have been terrifying. Raccoon? The word tasted foreign on my tongue, like a cold, bitter lie. I remembered the skittering, the way the creature's shadow had moved faster than I could process. But the nurse's reassuring look and the doctor's steady voice were slowly forcing the irrational fears back. My heart slowed, my breathing steadied, but an awful sense of dread settled deep inside me, even as the truth began to sink in. Yes, Dr. Patel said, and we'll be keeping you under observation for a while longer. Your paranoia and anxiety were exacerbated by the stress, and we want to ensure you recover before you return to normal life. The nurse stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder with a gentle but final pressure. You're not alone, Mr. Calloway. We're here to help you. As I stared up at the sterile ceiling, the room felt smaller, confined by the walls of my own fractured sanity. A shaky laugh escaped my lips, caught between relief and the gnawing realization that the most sinister thing I'd faced wasn't a monster in the shadows, but the way my mind had betrayed me. And deep inside me, the echo of those faint, clawed whispers still trembled.
Oriented, violent. At first, the authorities chalked it up to an outbreak of something seasonal. They always did. But within hours, it became clear that this was no ordinary infection. Sophie heard the first screams outside her apartment window. The sound was sharp and frantic, followed by the unmistakable sound of glass shattering. She stood frozen, holding her coffee mug, staring out into the street. A figure appeared in the middle of the road, stumbling and dragging one leg. It was disheveled, with torn clothing and pale skin stretched tight over its bones. It moved erratically, like a broken puppet being jerked around by invisible strings. And then it lunged. Sophie's heart stopped as she watched the figure sink its teeth into a passing pedestrian, who collapsed to the ground with a cry of agony. The pedestrian's body twitched, jerked violently, and then stood back up, now just like the thing that had attacked it. The infected, no longer human, were here. Her apartment became a prison. Sophie slammed the window shut, locking the door behind her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she snatched it up, frantically texting her friends and family. But all the messages were the same: chaos, panic. The government had declared martial law, but it was too late. Minutes later, the power went out. Darkness filled the apartment, the hum of the city outside now replaced by a strange silence, broken only by the occasional distant scream. Sophie tried to breathe through the panic swelling in her chest. A loud banging at the door broke through her thoughts. She froze, her hand on the doorknob, heart pounding in her ears. The banging came again, louder this time, followed by a low, guttural moan. Sophie's blood ran cold. She could hear them now, shuffling, scraping noises outside. The zombies. She backed away from the door, her breath shallow. She could hear voices in the hallway, low whispers, desperate cries. Someone was trapped out there. Someone was being hunted. The pounding on her door began again, relentless. Sophie didn't know how long she had until they broke through. She had to make a decision. Would she risk the unknown, opening the door to try to escape? Or would she hunker down and wait, hoping that somehow, against all odds, help would come? But as the pounding grew louder, as the terrifying sound of breaking wood reached her ears, she knew there was no waiting. No one was coming. Not now. The door splintered with a sharp crack, and Sophie turned, sprinting toward the back of the apartment. The only way out was through the fire escape. But just as her hand reached the door, she heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps behind her. It was too late. Sophie's breath came in ragged gasps as she twisted the fire escape's rusty handle. It wouldn't budge. Her pulse hammered in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. Behind her, the door shattered open, splinters flying across the floor. She heard their growls, guttural and low, like a distant animal that had forgotten how to speak. Panic surged, but Sophie forced herself to remain focused. She slammed her shoulder against the door to the fire escape once more. The hinges groaned, but this time, the door creaked open enough for her to squeeze through. She burst into the narrow alleyway, the morning sun now a faint memory beneath the oppressive, gray clouds that loomed overhead. The air felt thick with the weight of the unknown, and Sophie's senses were alive with fear. Every noise seemed amplified, the sound of her feet pounding against the pavement, the distant screams, and the echoes of the undead as they shuffled in pursuit. She didn't dare look back. The alley seemed endless, walls looming on either side. She could hear the low moans of the infected growing louder with every step, a chorus of death trailing her. Her legs burned, her breath ragged and unsteady. She had to keep moving. She had no choice. Ahead, she saw a flicker of movement, a shadow darting between the buildings. The person? No, it couldn't be. Everyone was dead. But there it was again, just a glimpse. Her heart skipped a beat. The city had become a graveyard, but somewhere, someone was still alive. Sophie veered toward the movement, her pulse quickening. She rounded a corner and found herself in a narrow street lined with abandoned cars. A man stood in front of a broken storefront, his back to her. He didn't seem to notice her approach, his focus on the wreckage scattered around him. "Hey!" Sophie called out, her voice hoarse from the dry air and terror. The man turned, eyes wide with a mixture of relief and disbelief. His clothes were torn, blood-stained, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. A shotgun was slung across his back, and he held a large backpack tightly in one hand, but he didn't seem ready to make any move toward her. "You're not one of them?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling as she took cautious steps closer. He studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing, before he nodded slowly. "Oh, not yet, anyway." Sophie didn't understand. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned toward the door of the shop behind him. "Come inside. It's not safe out here." Without hesitation, Sophie nodded, her heart still pounding in her chest, but she didn't care. She didn't want to be out here alone anymore. She followed him quickly, glancing over her shoulder to make sure she wasn't being followed. The man opened the door, leading her into the dark interior of the building. The air inside was stale and smelled faintly of mold. The glass of the front windows was shattered, and the space was eerily quiet, the only sound their footsteps on the broken floor tiles. "I'm Max," the man said, his voice low. He gave her a brief, calculating glance. "What's your name?" "Sophie," she replied, trying to steady her breath. "Are there more of you? People alive, I mean?" Max looked away for a moment, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the silence. "A few," he muttered, "but not many. It's a matter of time." Sophie felt a chill spread through her at the cold finality of his words. It was true. They were all doomed. There was no escape. The infection spread faster than anyone had anticipated, overwhelming the hospitals and the military. The world as she knew it was gone. Max's eyes softened as he noticed her discomfort. "Hey, don't get like that. We're not dead yet, all right?" But Sophie wasn't sure. She had seen it in the streets, how fast the infection took hold, how quickly it turned people into ravenous beasts. How long before it reached them? How long before she too was overwhelmed by the hunger? She clenched her fists, feeling the gnawing terror twist in her gut. "You look like you've been running for a while," Max said, interrupting her thoughts. "But you don't have a group?" Sophie shook her head. "I was alone when it started. I've been trying to get to my sister's house, but..." She paused, biting back the lump in her throat. The image of her sister's face, smiling at her the night before the outbreak, felt like a lifetime ago. Sophie had tried, she had tried to get to her. But the streets had become a war zone. There had been no way. Max gave her a solemn look. Everyone's trying to get to someone, but nobody gets there. The silence hung between them, thick with the weight of the harsh reality. Sophie rubbed her arms, trying to fight the cold, the dread that had taken root deep inside her. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from outside. Sophie jumped, heart racing. The sound was followed by another, and then another. Something, or someone, was pounding against the walls of the building. The moans of the infected grew louder, closer. Max cursed under his breath, reaching for the shotgun on his back. "We don't have much time," he muttered. "Grab whatever you can. We're leaving." Sophie's mind raced. She had no choice. She could either sit here and wait for the inevitable or try to fight for her life. She glanced around, her eyes scanning the room, searching for anything that could help her survive. She found a crowbar in the corner, dusty and abandoned. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Max looked at her, then to the door. "Get ready." She nodded, her grip tight around the crowbar. The pounding grew louder, relentless. Someone was at the door, pushing against it, desperate to get in. The door was going to give way. They didn't have much time left. The sound of the door groaning under pressure sent a sharp jolt of adrenaline through Sophie. Her grip on the crowbar tightened. She wasn't sure what she was supposed to do, swing it, block the door, or run, but the cold realization was sinking in. There was no escape without a fight. Max was already at the window, peering through the shattered glass, his hand gripping the shotgun tightly. His eyes flicked back to Sophie, dark with urgency. "They're getting closer," Max muttered, his voice low and strained. "We have to move." No. Sophie didn't hesitate. She looked around, scanning the darkened room for anything she could use. The shelves were toppled over, remnants of abandoned lives scattered across the floor, books, broken furniture, and empty food containers. Nothing seemed useful, nothing would save them, but still, her mind raced. Another crash, louder this time, as the door's hinges gave way. The first of the infected, pale, twisted, and bloodied, tumbled into the building. It was a woman, or had been once. Her face was a grotesque mockery of life, skin peeling in jagged sheets, her eyes vacant and wide, pupils just black holes. She let out a shrill, guttural scream that sent a ripple of panic through Sophie. "Sophie, behind you!" Max shouted. Sophie swung her crowbar at the woman, connecting with the side of her head. The blow sent a sickening crunch through the air, but it didn't stop the infected. It just staggered her for a moment before she lurched forward again, mouth open wide, desperate to tear into flesh. Max fired. The blast shattered the silence, and the infected woman collapsed into a heap, blood and viscera splattering across the floor. The shotgun's recoil left Max briefly unsteady, but he wasted no time. "We've got to go." Now, the room was filled with the sounds of other bodies crashing through the door, more infected pouring in from the alley, their shrieks growing louder by the second. Sophie's heart hammered in her chest, and she darted past the dead woman, following Max to the back of the store. He didn't stop, didn't pause for a second to think about what might be behind the door he was pushing open. It led to a narrow hallway that ran to the back of the building. Another door, a metal one this time, stood at the end of the hall. It was a second exit, an emergency escape. Sophie's legs burned from the sprint, but she couldn't let her fear take hold. Max was ahead of her, opening the metal door with a snap, his face tight with concentration. They were almost there. Almost. Another scream shattered the moment. Sophie turned to see two more infected stumbling down the hall toward them, their movements jerky and unnatural. They looked like they had been torn apart and put back together in the wrong order. One of them had half a face, its lower jaw hanging at an odd angle, yet it still managed to lunge toward her with terrifying speed. Max turned, firing again. But the blast went wide. The infected kept coming. Sophie's pulse spiked. She was so close, but they were closing in, the sound of their footsteps echoing like death on their heels. Max shoved her forward. "Go," he barked. Sophie stumbled, her chest tight with panic. She didn't want to die here. Not like this. Not in a hallway with the stench of death closing in around her. She pushed through the door behind Max, her heart pounding in her ears, but it was too late. The door slammed shut behind her with a sickening thud, and the moment the latch caught, she heard the clawing, scraping of the infected outside. They were trying to break through. Max turned to her, sweat dripping down his face, his breath heavy. "We have a moment. Just a moment." Sophie took a shaky breath, trying to steady herself. They had to keep moving, there was no time for hesitation. Behind them, the hallway extended into a small courtyard, overgrown with weeds and littered with the bones of the past. The air was thick with the stench of decay. The courtyard was their last chance. "There's a truck outside," Max said, pointing to the overgrown lot. "If we can make it there, we can leave." Sophie nodded, but something gnawed at her. The air felt wrong, heavier somehow. She could hear something more than the growls and moans of the infected. "Max," Sophie's voice faltered as she peered around, but before she could finish, she froze. The courtyard was no longer empty. Figures emerged from the shadows, their grotesque forms swaying with unnatural grace. These weren't like the others, the ones who had once been human and mindlessly shambled toward them. No, these were different. They were fast, controlled, as though something was guiding them. They moved like predators, like animals that had learned how to hunt. Max raised his shotgun, eyes widening in shock. "What the hell? Get back!" Sophie screamed, pulling him by the sleeve, trying to drag him away from the courtyard. But it was too late. The new infected closed in, encircling them, cutting off any escape route. Sophie's heart pounded as she realized that the figures weren't just infected, they were hunters. They were something worse. A shrill voice echoed in the distance, high-pitched and almost human, but distorted in a way that made Sophie's skin crawl. It was a sound like laughter, a twisted version of it, growing louder. The figures stopped in their tracks, their heads tilting, almost as if waiting for something. Or someone. Max shot, and the blast rang out across the courtyard, but it barely fazed them. Sophie barely registered the sound, her mind racing. The hunters weren't stopping. They were coming closer. There was only one choice left. She turned to Max, her eyes wide with desperation. "We need to run." Max's face was grim, but he didn't hesitate. "On 3, he said. The last dawn, part 4. Max's finger tightened around the trigger of the shotgun, the cold metal slick in his grip, but his hand was shaking. Sophie could see it, could feel the terror pulsing in the air. The infected hunters didn't move, not yet. They only watched, their hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light, their movements eerily still, as though they were toying with them. Sophie's pulse raced, the blood pounding in her ears. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she couldn't, not without Max. Not with these monsters standing between them and any chance of survival. "On 3, Max said again, his voice low but steady. Sophie nodded, her fingers wrapping tighter around the crowbar. The hunters were too close now. She could hear their heavy, labored breaths, could smell the rot that clung to them. There was no time to waste. They had to act. 1, Max's voice barely reached her over the sound of her heart, but it was enough. Sophie's grip tightened around the crowbar. She was ready. 2, the space between them and the hunters closed, the figures closing in from all directions. Sophie felt the heat of their presence, the weight of their hunger hanging in the air. She could almost feel their breath on her skin. And then Max moved. 3, he fired, the shotgun's blast deafening in the confined space. The force of the shot knocked one of the hunters off its feet, its body crumpling into the dirt with a sickening thud. But the others didn't hesitate. They charged. Sophie swung the crowbar with everything she had, the metal connecting with the face of one of the hunters. It stumbled back, but not far enough. Sophie swung again, hitting it in the ribs, the sickening crack of bone and the wet thud of impact echoing around the courtyard. But the creature didn't slow. It snarled, its face twisted in pain and rage, its hands reaching for her with unnerving speed. Max was beside her now, swinging the shotgun like a club, smashing it into another hunter's skull. The crack of bone filled the air, but the creature didn't fall. It turned on him, slashing at his chest with its claw-like hands, leaving deep gouges in his shirt and skin. "Max!" Sophie screamed. She didn't think. She acted. She lunged forward, swinging the crowbar in a wide arc. The metal connected with the hunter's head, and this time, it crumpled. Sophie didn't wait to see if it was truly dead. She spun, her eyes scanning the courtyard for more. The remaining hunters were circling them now, their movements more deliberate, as though they were assessing their prey. Sophie's chest tightened, panic threatening to overtake her, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford to lose control. Max's voice broke through the chaos, hoarse and frantic. "We need to get to the truck. Now." Sophie looked toward the overgrown lot. The truck was still there, its rusty form barely visible in the dim light, but the path was blocked. The hunters were closing in from all sides, their eyes gleaming with hunger. "Max, Sophie shouted. "Cover me!" Without waiting for a response, she darted forward, her legs pumping beneath her as she sprinted toward the truck. She could hear Max behind her, his shotgun barking again, but the sound was distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. One of the hunters lunged at her from the left, its claws swiping through the air with terrifying speed. Sophie barely managed to duck, feeling the air move as the claws missed by inches. She kept running, pushing her body harder than it had ever gone before. The truck was closer now, just a few steps away. She could see Max ahead of her, still fighting off the attackers. He was moving with desperate precision, each shot a warning to the others. But it was too much. Too many. Sophie reached the truck's bed, scrambling up onto it with shaking hands. She turned, her eyes scanning the courtyard for Max. He was still fighting, his back to her, his face a mask of determination. But there were too many. "Max!" Sophie screamed again, panic clawing at her throat. "We can't fight them all. We need to go." Max didn't answer. He didn't turn. He just kept fighting, his every movement a blur of violence. Sophie felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She couldn't just leave him, but she couldn't let herself die here either. Another hunter lunged at Max, its sharp claws finding purchase in his arm. He staggered back, but his resolve didn't falter. He shot point blank, and the creature's head exploded in a spray of blood and bone. But more kept coming. They never stopped. Sophie's heart raced, her breath shallow. The truck was her only chance, but Max was still out there. He was fighting, still giving it everything he had, but there was only so much one person could do. He wasn't invincible. He couldn't hold them all back forever. She made a choice. "Hold on," Sophie shouted, her voice barely reaching him over the chaos. She grabbed the truck's keys from her pocket, her fingers trembling as she fumbled with the ignition. The engine roared to life, shaking the truck's frame with a low growl. "Max!" she screamed again, but her voice faltered. She couldn't wait any longer. She couldn't. She slammed the truck in gear and tore out of the lot, the wheels spinning in the dirt, kicking up rocks and debris as the vehicle lurched forward. Sophie didn't look back. She couldn't. But the screams of the hunters echoed in the distance, fading as she drove, knowing they would not stop until they had her. They never stopped. Sophie's grip on the steering wheel tightened as the truck barreled down the abandoned highway. The engine roared, drowning out everything else, the gnashing of teeth, the screams of the undead, the whispers of her own doubts. She didn't dare glance in the rearview mirror. The darkness pressing in from all sides was enough to make her heart race. Max was still out there, somewhere. The thought gnawed at her. She should have waited. She should have tried harder. But the truth was, Sophie wasn't sure if waiting would have made any difference. The infected were too fast, too relentless. And now, with each mile between her and the hell she left behind, a sense of guilt twisted in her gut. She pushed the truck harder, the tires skidding against the cracked asphalt. The road stretched ahead, empty and endless, but it offered no comfort. Nothing felt safe anymore. There were no guarantees. The sky above was a sickly orange hue, the sun setting on a world that no longer made sense. Sophie had seen the city burn, watched it fall to ruin. People screamed in the streets, while the infected tore through every corner of the city like locusts. She had been one of the lucky ones, surviving by sheer willpower and dumb luck. But now, she was alone. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the radio, scanning for any sign of life, any hint that someone else was out there. The static buzzed, then crackled with faint voices. "This is Redstone Outpost. If anyone can hear this, we are taking survivors. We have supplies. We have shelter. Repeat, Redstone Outpost is accepting survivors. Please respond." Sophie's pulse quickened. A fleeting thread of hope. Her fingers flew to the mic, but the words caught in her throat. What was she supposed to say? She couldn't just tell them her name, her story. Not now, not when there was still so much uncertainty. Instead, she let out a shaky breath and pressed the button. "This is Sophie. I'm on my way." She didn't know if they heard her, but she had to believe they did. They had to. The truck rumbled onward, the tires kicking up dirt as the landscape outside became more desolate with each passing minute. Abandoned cars littered the roadside, some burnt-out husks, others overturned, their windows shattered. A new kind of silence had fallen over the world. The kind that made you question whether anything, or anyone, was left to save. It wasn't long before Sophie heard something strange, a distant sound, like a rhythmic thudding. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but the sound grew louder and closer. Her heart skipped a beat as her foot slammed on the brake, the truck screeching to a halt in the middle of the road. She threw the gear into park and jumped out, the cool air rushing over her as she scanned the horizon. The thudding wasn't a trick of her mind. It was a group of infected, several of them moving in her direction with that familiar, unholy urgency. They were running, not stumbling or dragging themselves as the others usually did. These were the hunters, the ones with the speed and ferocity to tear through anything in their path. They were coming for her. She dove back into the truck, slamming the door shut, her hands fumbling for the gear shift. Her foot slammed back down on the accelerator, but she wasn't fast enough. They were almost on her. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't have much time. There was no way she could outrun them. The truck's engine roared, but it wasn't enough. The first one reached the vehicle, slamming its body against the side with a sickening thud. Sophie gasped, her fingers gripping the wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. The truck lurched forward, but the infected didn't stop. One of them clawed at the side window, the glass cracking under its sharp, rotting nails. Sophie slammed the wheel to the right, sending the truck careening off the road and into the overgrown grass. The infected stumbled behind her, but they were too fast. Too hungry. Max's face flashed in her mind again, his battered form fighting off the creatures, his voice screaming for her to go. She had failed him. She had left him behind. But she couldn't think like that. She couldn't let the guilt drag her down. Her foot slammed the accelerator once more, but the truck was struggling, the wheels spinning on the uneven ground. She could feel the creatures gaining on her, their snarls growing louder with each passing second. Ahead, the faint silhouette of a structure appeared, Redstone Outpost. Sophie's heart skipped. Could she make it? Could she survive long enough to reach the outpost, to find safety? Or was this just another illusion, another fleeting hope that would fade before she could reach it? The truck's engine sputtered, and Sophie cursed. The vehicle had taken too much damage. She could hear the clunking from the rear axle as the suspension gave way. There was no way she would make it without a miracle. She had one chance. The hunter lunged at the truck's door, its rotted fingers scraping the metal, and Sophie saw the rest of them closing in from all sides. She slammed the gear shift into reverse, jerking the truck backward as the undead slammed against it from all sides. She had to go. With a scream of fury, Sophie wrenched the wheel and floored the accelerator. The truck lurched forward, but she wasn't driving. Not anymore. She was running. As the world outside blurred, Sophie didn't look back. Not yet. Sophie pushed the truck as hard as it would go, the engine roaring with desperate power, but it was clear that she wasn't in control anymore. The road was slipping away beneath her, swallowed by the darkness. The once vibrant landscape had turned into a gray, twisted version of itself, everything coated in a sickly, unnatural hue. The headlights barely pierced the gloom, and the shadows seemed to writhe and crawl in every corner of her vision. Redstone Outpost was just ahead, or so she hoped. Her eyes darted back to the rearview mirror, no sign of the hunters yet, but she could hear them. The thudding, the growls, they were relentless. If she couldn't make it to the outpost, then what? Her pulse raced. Her grip on the wheel was slick with sweat. She could hear her breath coming in ragged bursts, feel the panic rising in her throat like a choking weight. She glanced at the fuel gauge. Near empty. Ahead, the outpost loomed, a dilapidated structure standing like a dark sentinel against the dying light. The walls were broken, some windows shattered, but it was still standing. Still a sign of life, even if it was barely hanging on. The words on the rusted sign, barely legible now, spelled the hope she desperately clung to, Redstone Outpost. The truck hit a bump, jolting Sophie, but she kept her focus. This was it. She had to reach it no matter what. Her hands trembled, slipping slightly off the steering wheel. She willed herself to stay calm, to not look behind her, to focus on the narrow stretch of road that would lead her to the gates of whatever safety the outpost might hold. Then it happened. The truck sputtered, a violent jolt, followed by a sickening grinding noise. The engine stalled. Shit! Sophie screamed, desperately cranking the ignition, but the truck refused to start. The empty tank mocked her with its silence. She couldn't believe it. She was so close to salvation. The growls grew louder, closer, and Sophie's pulse shot up. Her breath was coming faster now, heart slamming against her chest like a drumbeat. She slammed the gearshift into park, unbuckled her seatbelt, and threw open the door. No time to waste. She didn't look back. Sophie bolted from the truck, the cold night air biting at her skin. The dry, cracked ground scraped against her boots as she ran. The outpost's gates were only 100 yards away, but it felt like a mile. Her legs burned, every step a battle, but the sounds of the hunters, guttural, horrible, drove her forward, the instinct to survive overriding everything else. With every step, the ground seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. She didn't dare look back. Her heart was pounding in her throat, her breath ragged, but she could see the shape of the outpost gates ahead. Just a little further. She reached them. The gates were partially open, the heavy metal doors ajar just enough for her to squeeze through. She threw herself through the gap, her shoulders scraping the side of the doorframe as she tumbled to the ground inside the compound. She pushed herself up, gasping for air, and looked around. The outpost was eerily silent. Abandoned, seemed. The structures were dilapidated, like everything else, but the lights, faint but steady, flickered in the distance, casting shadows on the walls of the central building. Sophie's hand shot to the gate, pulling it shut as quietly as she could. She felt a surge of relief. She was inside. She was safe for now. But the relief was short-lived. The moment the gate clicked into place, a loud, bone-chilling scream echoed from the dark outside. The infected were close. Too close. She turned to face the building. "Hello," she shouted, her voice rough, filled with desperation. "Anyone here? I need help." Nothing. She didn't wait for an answer. She ran toward the nearest building, her footfalls echoing in the silence. The interior was dark, filled with rusted furniture and broken windows. Abandoned. A sudden movement at the far end of the hallway made her freeze. Someone was there. "Who's there?" Sophie demanded, her voice trembling. A figure stepped out of the shadows. A man, tall, gaunt, with a wild, untamed beard and piercing eyes. He looked at her without speaking, his expression unreadable. "I'm Sophie," she said, breathing hard. "I'm a survivor. I need help. I've been running for days. There are more out there." The man's gaze flicked behind her, to the gates. Then he nodded slightly. "We've all been running for days." His voice was low, hoarse. "And there's nothing left to help you." Sophie's heart sank. The man stepped closer, his eyes never leaving her. "You're not safe here." "No one is." "Not anymore." Sophie recoiled, her blood running cold. "What do you mean?" He looked at her, eyes filled with something darker than the shadows around them. "You think the infected are the worst of it?" He chuckled, a hollow, mirthless sound. "You haven't seen anything yet?" The lights flickered, then went out. The hallway was plunged into darkness. Sophie's breath hitched. She felt the panic rise again. She spun, but before she could run, she heard it, the sound of the infected outside, clawing at the gates. The gates! She had forgotten to lock them properly. And then, from the shadows, she heard a voice. A voice she hadn't heard in days. "Help me, Sophie." She froze. The voice was faint, broken, but unmistakable. Sophie's chest constricted. Was it really him? Had he made it? Her pulse raced as she turned back toward the darkness. But the man, the stranger, grabbed her arm. "No," he whispered urgently. "It's too late." Sophie shook her head, struggling against his grip. "Let go of me. I have to help him. It's Max." The man's face twisted into something grotesque, almost inhuman. "You don't understand. You don't get it. He's not Max. He's not anyone anymore." Sophie screamed, wrenching herself free. She darted down the hallway, driven by the sound of that voice, even though her mind screamed at her to stop. She reached the door at the end, the heavy wooden door creaking open as she shoved it aside. There, in the center of the room, was Max, or what was left of him. His face was covered in blood, his body grotesquely twisted, a terrible, unnatural mockery of the person he once was. He was alive, but not in the way she had hoped. His eyes were vacant, empty. Sophie, the word was a rasp, his lips trembling. She ran to him, but as she did, something inside her shifted. She realized, with sickening clarity, that there was no escape. No safety. No redemption. Max reached for her, his rotting hands grabbing at her. She tried to pull away, but it was too late. The infection had taken root too deeply. He was one of them now. With a sob, Sophie backed away, but there was no place to run. The walls of Redstone Outpost seemed to close in on her. And in the dark, she realized the truth. There was no hope left.
There was nothing remarkable about the engraving tool itself. It was small, fashioned from iron, with a wooden handle worn smooth from years of use. It had belonged to my father, an artisan of modest acclaim, who had etched patterns of elegance and intricacy onto everything from goblets to mausoleum plates. When the tool came into my possession, it was more a token of his life than a piece of equipment I intended to use. Yet, on the day I first held it in my hand, something stirred in me, a sense of purpose, of destiny even. I was no craftsman, but in that moment, I was overcome with the desire to create. I remember the first piece I made, a simple design carved into a discarded scrap of wood. It was crude and without symmetry, but the act itself felt transformative. It was as though the tool guided my hand, whispering shapes and lines into my mind. I began to carve obsessively. Anything that could bear a mark, a wooden box, a stone paperweight, even the surface of my own desk, became a canvas for my growing compulsion. At first, my work brought admiration. Neighbors and acquaintances marveled at the intricacy of my designs, though they often remarked on the unsettling nature of the patterns. They were too sharp, too erratic, as if each piece was imbued with a hidden disquiet. But I paid their words no mind. The more I carved, the more I felt the tool's influence. It was as if it spoke to me in dreams, its voice low and insistent, urging me to create ever more complex and elaborate designs. Soon, my work began to take on a darker tone. I found myself etching shapes I couldn't explain, twisting forms that seemed to writhe upon the surface, faces that stared out with eyes too knowing, too alive. My wife, Clara, was the first to notice the change in me. She would stand behind me as I worked, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze filled with a mixture of curiosity and unease. "You've been at it for hours," she would say, her voice tinged with concern. "Don't you think you should rest?" But I couldn't rest. The tool wouldn't let me. I tried to explain this to her, to make her understand, but the words caught in my throat. How could I describe the pull of the engraver, the way it seemed to sing to me in a language I could almost understand? One night, she tried to take it from me. I remember the moment vividly, her hand reaching for the tool, her fingers brushing against mine. The rage that surged within me was unlike anything I had ever felt. I snatched the tool away, my voice a snarl as I told her never to touch it again. After that, Clara grew distant. She would leave the room whenever I began to work, her absence a hollow weight in the house. I told myself I didn't care, that she didn't understand my need to create. But the truth gnawed at me, a quiet guilt that I tried to bury beneath layers of wood and stone. It was around this time that the dreams began. They were vivid, almost lucid, filled with scenes of carving and creation. But the materials were no longer inert objects. They were living things, flesh and bone yielding beneath the engraver's touch. I would wake drenched in sweat, the tool clutched tightly in my hand, its blade glinting in the moonlight. The designs I etched during these nights were unlike anything I had done before. They were chaotic, violent, each line a jagged wound on the surface. Yet they felt right, as though they were the truest expression of my art. The first incident occurred on a cold autumn morning. A neighbor's dog, a sprightly terrier that often wandered into our yard, was found dead near my workshop. Its body bore strange marks, as though something sharp had traced patterns across its fur and skin. Clara confronted me, her face pale with accusation. "Did you do this?" she demanded, holding the lifeless animal in her arms. I denied it, of course. I had no memory of harming the creature. But deep down, a seed of doubt took root. The designs etched into the dog's flesh were eerily similar to those I had created in my dreams. As the days turned to weeks, the world around me seemed to warp and twist. Shadows grew longer, their edges sharper, as if the lines I carved were seeping into reality itself. Clara's distance turned to fear, and I would catch her watching me with a mixture of pity and dread. I began to hear the whispers more clearly. They weren't coming from the tool, as I had once thought, but from the objects I had engraved. They would murmur to me in the dead of night, their voices filled with longing and malice. "You must finish," they would say. "You must complete the pattern." My compulsion grew insatiable. Each day I locked myself in the workshop, the engraver moving in frenzied strokes over every surface I could find. Clara avoided me entirely now, her presence reduced to fleeting glimpses as she passed by the closed door. I caught her once in the kitchen, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness, her voice trembling as she asked, "What are you doing to us?" The question haunted me, yet I couldn't stop. There was something I needed to finish, though I didn't know what it was. The patterns I created no longer made sense even to me. They were maddeningly intricate, their lines converging into labyrinths that seemed to spiral into depths unseen. One night, as I stared at my latest creation, a dense, swirling design carved into the tabletop, I noticed something strange. The lines seemed to move, not in the subtle way one might perceive in a trick of the eye, but a deliberate, slithering motion, as though the carving itself was alive. I backed away, my breath hitching. The whispers grew louder, their tone urgent, almost pleading. "Closer," they said. "You must look closer." I leaned in, my hand trembling as I traced the lines with my eyes. Within the pattern, I saw something, an image, a face. It was grotesque, its features twisted and malformed, yet unmistakably human. And then, as if it were waiting for me to see it, the face turned to me and smiled. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The tool fell from my hand, clattering to the floor. The whispers turned to laughter, low and guttural, echoing through the room. That night, Clara left me. She didn't say goodbye. I only realized she was gone when I emerged from the workshop and found the house silent, her belongings missing. For a moment, I considered going after her, begging her to return. But the thought faded as quickly as it had come. The tool lay on my workbench, its blade glinting in the dim light. It called to me, its voice now a roar in my mind. I picked it up, my fingers curling around the handle, and returned to my work. The days blurred together after that. My body wasted away, my hands blistered and raw from carving. The world outside became a distant memory, its light and warmth replaced by the cold, unyielding presence of the engraver. I began to lose time. Hours, sometimes days, would vanish, leaving me disoriented and weak. The designs grew more complex, their lines intertwining in ways that seemed to defy geometry. One evening, as I etched into the surface of an old wooden chair, I felt a sharp pain in my hand. I looked down to see blood seeping from my palm, the engraver's blade embedded in my flesh. But the tool didn't fall. It stayed firmly in my grip, its presence now a part of me. I watched, transfixed, as the blood dripped onto the carving, pooling in the grooves of the pattern. The lines absorbed it greedily, their color deepening to a vivid crimson. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "Just a little more," they said. "You're so close now." That night, the house changed. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with an oppressive weight. The patterns I had carved into the furniture and walls began to glow faintly, their light pulsing like a heartbeat. I felt it then, the presence. It was no longer confined to the engraver or the designs. It was everywhere, filling the space around me, pressing against my mind. I tried to fight it, to resist the pull of the tool, but it was futile. My hands moved of their own accord, carving lines into the floor, the ceiling, even my own skin. The pain was excruciating, yet I couldn't stop. The patterns began to spread, their lines crawling across the room like living veins. As the final line was etched, the house shuddered. A deep, resonant sound filled the air, like the tolling of a distant bell. The patterns converged, their glow intensifying until the room was bathed in blinding light. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the workshop. I stood in a vast, empty expanse, the ground beneath me a swirling mass of the same patterns I had carved. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sky above was a sickly shade of green. In the distance, I saw them, the faces. Hundreds, perhaps thousands, of them, all carved into the ground, their eyes fixed on me. "You've done well," a voice said, low and resonant. I turned to see the figure from my dreams. It was towering, its form a mass of shifting lines and shapes, its face an ever-changing swirl of patterns. "You've brought us through," it said, its voice filled with a terrible reverence. "Now, we shall carve you." I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. My body was frozen, held in place by the oppressive weight of the patterns beneath me. The towering figure began to move closer, each step causing the ground to ripple as if it were alive. "You brought this upon yourself," the voice resonated, neither cruel nor kind, merely a statement of fact. Its shifting form seemed to absorb the faint light from the ground, growing darker and more immense with each passing moment. The carved faces on the ground twisted and contorted, their mouths opening wide as if in silent wails of agony. Their eyes burned with an eerie light, locking onto me. I felt their despair, their fear, and their pain as though it were my own. "Why?" I managed to whisper, my voice barely audible over the deafening silence. The figure paused, tilting its amorphous head as though considering my question. "Because," it answered, its voice now a chorus of the faces surrounding me, "creation demands sacrifice. You opened the door, and now you are the offering." I felt a searing pain in my chest as the patterns on the ground began to crawl upward, spreading over my skin like molten metal. My body convulsed, every nerve alight with unbearable agony. I clawed at my arms, my legs, trying to tear the lines away, but they only sank deeper, embedding themselves into my flesh. The figure watched, impassive, as the transformation continued. My skin split open along the lines of the patterns, blood seeping from the wounds in rhythmic pulses. The faces on the ground began to chant, their voices rising in a haunting melody that reverberated through the air. I begged for mercy, my words dissolving into incoherent screams as the lines consumed me. My vision blurred, the world around me fading into a kaleidoscope of shifting patterns and colors. And then, just as the pain became unbearable, it stopped. I opened my eyes to find myself standing in the workshop. The engraver lay on the workbench, its blade dull and lifeless. The room was dark and silent, the oppressive presence that had haunted me now gone. I stumbled to the mirror, desperate to see what had become of me. My reflection stared back, but it was not my own. The lines had etched themselves permanently into my skin, forming an intricate network of scars that pulsed faintly with an otherworldly light. My eyes were no longer human. They glowed with the same eerie hue as the patterns. I tried to speak, but my voice was no longer mine. It echoed with the whispers that had tormented me for so long, a symphony of voices that spoke in unison. "You are the vessel," they said, "the harbinger of creation." Days turned into weeks, though I no longer counted time in the way I once had. The workshop became my prison, its walls now a canvas for the patterns that poured forth from me. I carved incessantly, my hands moving of their own accord, creating designs that defied comprehension. The town grew silent. I noticed fewer lights in the windows, fewer voices in the streets. Clara never returned, though I doubted she would have recognized me if she had. One night, as I worked on a particularly elaborate carving, I heard footsteps outside the workshop. A shadow passed across the window, followed by a soft knock at the door. "Who's they?" I called, my voice a hollow echo. The door creaked open, and a figure stepped inside. It was a man, his face pale and drawn, his eyes wide with fear. He held a knife in trembling hands, his gaze fixed on me. "You've cursed this town," he said, his voice shaking. "You've brought something terrible here. I have to stop you." I stood motionless as he approached, the blade glinting in the dim light. He lunged at me, but before he could strike, the patterns on my skin flared to life. The man froze, his body contorting as the lines spread from me to him. He screamed as they etched themselves into his flesh, his form twisting and writhing until he was unrecognizable. When it was over, he lay on the floor, his body a lifeless husk. The patterns crawled back to me, their light dimming as they settled beneath my skin. The whispers returned, louder than ever. "More," they said. "We need more." I realized then what I had become. The engraver had not only opened a door, it had made me its guardian, its tool. I was no longer a man but a conduit for the presence that now inhabited this place. The workshop's walls pulsed with a sickly glow, the patterns shifting and twisting as if alive. Outside, the world grew darker, the air thick with an unnatural stillness. I no longer slept, no longer ate. My existence was consumed by the need to carve, to create, to feed the presence that had claimed me. And as the faces of the townsfolk began to appear in my patterns, their screams joining the chorus of whispers, I knew there was no escape. I was the vessel, the harbinger of creation, and I would carve until there was nothing left. The days and nights blurred into a single, unending moment, my mind trapped in a labyrinth of whispers and commands. Each stroke of the chisel felt like tearing a piece of my soul, and yet I couldn't stop. My hands worked of their own accord, driven by a force that twisted my will into submission. The workshop's walls had transformed entirely. The sickly glow intensified, pulsating in time with the rhythm of my carving. The patterns I etched were no longer mine. They emerged fully formed in my mind, alien and incomprehensible. They weren't meant for human eyes, and yet they poured out of me like a torrent, filling every surface of the room. One evening, as the last remnants of sunlight vanished, the door to the workshop creaked open. I hadn't touched it, nor had I allowed anyone entry since I had begun. My heart froze as I turned to see who, or what, had come. Standing in the doorway was a figure I couldn't immediately place. Its shape wavered, as if my eyes refused to fully focus on it. The shadows seemed to cling to its form, and the air grew colder with each passing second. "You have done well," it said, its voice like the sound of wood splintering under pressure. The figure moved closer, its steps echoing unnaturally in the small space. I recoiled, clutching the chisel in my hand as if it could protect me. "Who are you?" I managed to rasp. The figure tilted its head, an unnatural movement that sent a shiver down my spine. "I am the architect," it replied. "And you are my hand." The words struck me with the weight of finality. I tried to protest, to demand answers, but the room itself seemed to conspire against me. The walls pulsed violently, and the carved faces, those of the townsfolk, shifted. Their eyes opened, mouths contorted in silent screams. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, tears streaming down my face. The architect extended a hand, long and gnarled like the roots of an ancient tree, and pointed toward the largest wall in the workshop. The patterns I had carved there shimmered, shifting to reveal an immense doorway. It was not a doorway meant for this world. Its proportions were wrong, its angles twisting and defying logic. "It is time to open the gate," the architect said. "No," I breathed, shaking my head. "I can't." "You already have," it interrupted, its tone devoid of emotion. The room shuddered violently, and the air was filled with a deafening cacophony. The screams of the carved faces grew louder, merging with the whispers that had plagued me for weeks. My body moved without my consent, my hands dragging the chisel across the wall in frantic strokes. With each cut, the doorway began to widen, the glow spilling out, becoming blinding. Something was coming through, its presence immense and unknowable. As the doorway widened, the air thickened, choking me with its oppressive weight. My body trembled with the effort to resist, but my hands betrayed me, carving with a speed and precision I could not control. The screams of the faces on the walls grew louder, their once muted agony now a crescendo of despair. The architect stood motionless, its gnarled hand raised as if orchestrating my movements. "Do not resist," it commanded. "You are but a vessel. To fight is futile." The light spilling from the doorway became a vortex, pulling at everything within the workshop. Papers, tools, and even shards of wood were sucked into its depths, disappearing into the impossible void. My body swayed, my feet dragging toward the opening as the pull grew stronger. Something was emerging. At first, it was only a shadow, formless and vast. Then, it began to take shape, an enormous mass of writhing tendrils and shifting forms that defied comprehension. My mind recoiled at the sight, a splitting pain ripping through my skull as my thoughts tried to process its existence. "What is this?" I managed to choke out, the words barely audible over the roar of the vortex. "The beginning," the architect replied, its voice reverent. "You have brought forth what lies beyond, the true form." The entity from the doorway extended one of its tendrils into the workshop, its texture glistening and otherworldly. The air grew colder still, and the faces on the walls began to contort in new ways. Their mouths stretched wide, and an unearthly wail erupted from them, a sound that seemed to pierce the fabric of reality itself. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my head as the sound overwhelmed me. The tendril hovered above me, its surface shifting and rippling as though it were alive. I could feel its intent, a probing curiosity mingled with an unfathomable hunger. "No," I gasped, scrambling backward. "This isn't what I wanted." The architect's hollow gaze fixed on me. "It was never about what you wanted. Your will was a means to an end. And now, it is complete." The tendril descended, wrapping itself around my arm. A searing pain shot through me, and I screamed, the sound lost in the cacophony around me. The entity's touch was both freezing and burning, its presence burrowing into my very essence. As it pulled me closer, the faces on the walls seemed to watch, their gazes filled with an eerie mixture of pity and relief. The vortex intensified, and I realized with dawning horror that the workshop itself was being consumed. The walls crumbled into the light, piece by piece, until only the floor remained beneath me. And then, the tendril pulled me through the doorway. Beyond the threshold was a realm of chaos and contradiction. The air was thick, yet I could breathe. The ground beneath me shifted like water, yet held me firm. The sky was an ever-changing tapestry of impossible colors, and the entity loomed above it all, its true form stretching endlessly into the void. I was no longer a man. I could feel my body unraveling, my thoughts dissolving into the greater whole. The entity's voice filled my mind, a chorus of whispers that spoke of ancient truths and incomprehensible designs. "You are now one with the pattern," it said. "You are eternal." Time lost meaning as I became part of the entity, my existence reduced to a single thread in the vast tapestry of its being. I saw the architect standing at the edge of the void, watching as the doorway began to close. Its work was done, and it faded into the shadows from which it had come. The faces of the townsfolk lingered in my mind, their screams echoing through the endless expanse. I realized, with what little remained of my humanity, that I had condemned them all.